workshop of California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection into order. And we have allocated the afternoon to starting our discussion of the comments we received in our 60-day comment period, and the comments are extensive, as we have all discussed as we're trying to get ready for this meeting. So I've asked Ms. Hannigan to actually give us a little background information on how these comments have been categorized and so on here, and we're going to have to deal with these comments, and it's going to take us a while. We're not going to get through it today. So this is the start of a longer discussion, and thanks to everybody that sent us in comments. It's always great when people take the time to read the work carefully and give us something to go on. So Ms. Hannigan, would you give us a little background on the comment period and how you categorize the comments into the matrix that we have in front of us?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Edith Hannigan, board staff, good afternoon. So board members have a binder in front of you. All this information is available online with a couple different documents. The first one is just a list of all of the people and or organizations who have sent in public comment and what organization, if any, they're affiliated with, and where generally they are if they provided a location. It's not. So if you're looking to see if Joe Smith from El Cajon sent a letter, you can find out. This is organized alphabetically by last name. The next page is a document explaining how I categorize the public comment that we received. There's it's about 2 full pages. I tried to strike a balance between clear categories, but also not getting so specific that there was like one comment per category. But if you have any questions about what these mean or what I'm referring to today, or just as we go through this, please let me know. The next set of pages is an overview of the comments that were received by the board. The comment period was open for 60 days between April 1st and May 31st of this year. These comments, I cannot stress enough that these comments, this spreadsheet does not reflect the full content of the letters received by the board. I left out salutations, I left out personal, if somebody was giving extensive background on their credentials. I left that out, and I really wanted to pull out the meat of their comments on the Vegetation Treatment Program draft EIR. I do highly encourage you to read the letters that are in the back of your binders in full to grasp the entire context of what people are writing in. This spreadsheet also does not include any comments that are directly related to the Chaparral Institute's letters that came from private persons. So if a private person wrote in and said, I support the Chaparral Institute's letter, I did not put that comment in this spreadsheet. But again, I encourage you to read all of the comment is printed out in the back of your binders. I encourage you to read them, again, to grasp the full context of what people are writing and what they're saying about this document. In all of your binders should also be a disc that has all of this information, and then also has if an organization sent in attachments or exhibits, or if they sent in there's quite a few letters that cite a significant amount of scientific literature. They very conveniently have sent us any letters, any research papers that they cited. Those are all on that disc that you have. So again, what I anticipate discussing at this meeting and going forward is this spreadsheet version of the comments. But as you go through the letters, if there's a comment that you see that you want to address in the meetings, please bring it up to me or at the meetings, and I'll make sure it gets into this spreadsheet and make sure that it gets discussed. As we go through, and council will have to provide some more specifics on this, but one thing to keep in mind is that unlike the last time when we were talking about public comment, or not public comment, but when we were talking about board member comments on the VTP, there were we could decide to go or no go on a comment, to go with someone's recommendation or to skip it. One thing that we have to do when we respond to this public comment, we can't just say, thank you for your comment, we went in another direction. We do have to have, the board has to provide a reasoning for going in the direction that you're choosing. And again, it's up to board council can probably provide more guidance on how detailed and how justified that has to be, but that is something to think about as you're discussing these comments, to give back to the VTP team or whoever makes revisions on this. We don't just need an acceptance or rejection of a comment, but we also need a why behind that. So just something to consider. So that's my overview of the material in front of you and what we're asking of you as you review this public comment. If there's any questions, or I can.
I think let's actually go into the categories.
Yeah, do you want me to just go over that sheet? Yeah. So this sheet is also arranged alphabetically. Oh, something else important to note, I'm sorry. This spreadsheet is organized by category. So you'll see like all of the comment numbers are out of order. There'll be a comment from Joe Smith followed immediately by a comment from Tom Smith followed immediately by a comment from Jane Smith. So it's kind of, but I thought organizing them categorically would maybe help us synthesize them a little bit better. And then kind of prioritize the order you might want to talk about those categories, but that, if you see something that's very far back and you want to discuss it at the next meeting, please bring it up, and this is absolutely movable and changeable. So the first comment, so administrative just refers to a couple different things. It refers to the administration and implementation of the vegetation treatment program that you're proposing. So it's comments that would be more relevant to CAL FIRE once they actually get this program up and running, rather than the program, setting up the program. Comments regarding paperwork, signatures, et cetera, that don't apply to the program or the environmental impact evaluation of the program. There was a question, for example, about like the signature on the notice of preparation and who Matt Diaz is and things like that. And then other comments regarding sources, citations, definitions, et cetera, that don't have a substantive impact on the program. So editorial comments for the most part. The second category is the alternatives analysis. Those are any comments that are have to do with I think it was 4 alternatives that we analyzed in the document, including the proposed project. So some of them are comments on the actual alternatives that we've chosen to analyze. Some of them are comments suggesting new alternatives to analyze that should be included in this document. I think those are kind of the comments are one of those two. There are questions about, or there are public comment regarding whether or not the board or the department have the authority to initiate this program. There's not too many of those, but there's a few in there wanting the connection with Public Resources Code a little bit clearer. And then you'll see a few comments here that start out with CEQA. And although all of these comments are more or less part of whether or not this document how well it complies with the California Environmental Quality Act. These ones are ones that are specifically about like the environmental impacts, and the commenter themselves specifically brought up, under CEQA such and such, is my concern. So that's why they have that kind of header in front of them. And there's a couple different things people brought up. There's CEQA and establishing baseline conditions. There's some public comment about whether the documents adequately establish the existing baseline conditions that you're going to conduct this environmental review against. There's a couple comments about the need to recirculate the document if major changes are made. There weren't too many of those. There are some comments about the significance thresholds that the document uses to analyze whether or not there will be impacts. There's questions about, as a programmatic EIR, as a tiering document where you have a programmatic statewide document and then the project level environmental review, whether or not there's a few different themes of comments under this, but whether or not this is adequate as a tiering document. And then there's a few questions about just overall compliance with the California Environmental Quality Act. There's a few comments. Ecological values is just general comments about the ecological settings around the state. Environmental impact analysis. You'll see this in the document. What I did was environmental impacts analysis, and then there's a dash, and in brackets there's whatever that, more specifically what that comment is referring to. So this way, all of the environmental impacts analysis, I could neatly arrange them alphabetically, but you get a little bit of what impact specifically people are talking about. There's a lot of there's questions about herbivory, herbicides, prescribed fire, the analysis in the biological resources section. So I tried to as put a little descriptor next to it. Again, trying to keep in mind not giving you too many categories, but helping to lump things together. A historical reference is just a reference to past comments on the VTP EIR. If someone wrote in and said, I incorporate by reference my 2013 letter, that's what that means. Inadequate data is a pretty wide-ranging category that basically refers to whether or not the letter writer believes that we've utilized adequate environmental science and data. Some of it is about our map quality. Some of it is about just whatever scientific documents we chose to use. And then there's and some other. That's basically it. Mitigation measures is just comments regarding the mitigation measures in the environmental analysis. There's a few comments, I think mostly from one or two organizations, about plant pests and pathogens and protecting, and how the document addresses those. There's a lot of people have questions that I filed under program effectiveness, program necessity, and program objectives. And those are basically variations on whether or not the letter writer believes this program meets the stated goals and objectives of the board and the document, and whether or not, and some of it is an assessment of whether or not the document meets the board's stated goals, but whether or not the document meets the letter writer's goals and priorities. So there's a couple different variations of that we received about whether it would be effective versus whether it's even necessary, and then this with the objectives. Program scope and contents is another categorization that I put some more specifics and brackets in. This is basically about public comment referring to the chosen scale of the program and the treatment. It could be the treatment acres. Some of it is about the actual treatment types and activities under the program. So these are kind of any type of question that was about the actual the tools, the management tools used in the program, or the geographic size and scale of the program fell under program scope and contents. Project scale analysis is any comments on the project scale analysis checklist that we have. Public involvement is any type of comments discussing project or program transparency, both from the programmatic EIR standpoint and the project level review, or comments regarding public participation in project development at the local level. Standard project requirements is anything about the standard project requirements that we've put into the program, and vegetation classification is any comments regarding the chosen vegetation classification system for the program. There were a few of those, but so that's how I categorize these. And again, this is a very fluid document. I want it to be understandable and workable for you as board members. So if there's any changes that would make any part of this better, please, and workable for you, please let me know.
So, before we delve in with the sleeve rolled on, just
we can do a variety of things. He said, think about it. Some of them which really require counsel, probably we should wait until we have full counsel present. This is the source. Ellie isn't here this afternoon. So some of those things, we don't have a lot of JDs sitting on this board. So might be good to not go too far down structure of this stuff. Where we don't have the expertise to render a judgment without some counsel. Doesn't avoid the decision, but we should do what our resources to do. So we could start with the high-level discussion. We could jump into one of these program areas, feelings about where we might start. Should we start from program necessity? But interested in the best way to use our time as we start going through these elements.
Can I make one clarification?
Oh, please.
I just want to make sure. So while we do have to have not just the yes or no, but the why for each of these, we don't, as I'm sure you can tell by reading them, there are many repetitive comments. We can, so I don't need a response necessarily for every single comment that's in the spreadsheet, but we do need a response for the any unique type of comment, because we can go back to other letters and say, please see response to letter 1-4, what have you.
So the example, obviously, being when you delve into these, the comment on lack of detail.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you need a response, or it feels to me like that's a judgment call. We can't just have a lack of response to lack of detail, because the lack of detail applies to different elements of the plan. So at least at that level, we need a response to lack of detail in elements of the plan X, as opposed to the question about a lack of detail at the level of the plan. Is that the correct interpretation?
Yeah.
Are we all daunted? We're good.
I guess I was looking at these as trying, maybe today, this is the first one, is trying to hit the bigger topic items that maybe have potential impact to large places in the document.
Yeah.
It seemed to be, that's kind of what I was reading a lot of the letters for, as opposed to whether a specific SPR should have been 20 feet or 25 feet.
Right.
I figure we will get to those eventually, but I wasn't as focused on those for today. I did have a lot of questions about the CEQA and claims about CEQA, but it sounds like maybe those would be deferred until we have counsel here.
I think it might be a better solution.
Yeah.
I'm just...
Because those were kind of overarching.
They are overarching things, and in some cases, I feel like I'll do some homework, but I still won't be a lawyer after I've done my homework on some of those questions. And I don't think the government is expecting us to be able to do like this.
No. And that was the. And I don't know, you'll have to let me know if this is more of one of the, because there's several of the secret ones I pretty much can figure out they are lawyer-like issues. But the one I was most curious about was in several of the letters, of course, these comments are repeated sometimes, was the whole concept of tiering and what is in a master agreement versus what is then on the project. And is that something where we need to have our counsel provide us some instruction? Because I asked it more of a question. Or do we need more of a SQL person that has a strong, one of the team members, our board staff, to kind of educate us on what they believe the process is?
Having not asked the staff to prepare some comments on that issue, I'm reluctant to make them.
Please don't.
I think even a small 1 or 2 page backgrounder for us on how that issue applies for the PDIR might not be a bad idea when we get into those discussions. So I'm thinking I would defer that question. but not just making more presentation. We might want a page or two that we can use as a touchstone to help us in that discussion. So.
Yeah, whether it's from the team or whoever, it doesn't matter to me. I just would like to have a better foundation of what do we view the tiering document versus master document, what responsibilities lie. And I agree, I don't think it has to be terribly exhaustive, but it would be something that would help in my mind. Because an awful lot of comments are kind of pinned on that concept.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
And I mean, Mark, you've had a lot of experience with these kind of documents.
Not a lot of programmatic, but I agree with a lot of that. We need the legal advice and then a lot of things on the project-specific analysis versus programmatic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's clear. Many of these comments, as I read them, were the linkage between programmatic documents at project level, what is appropriate at one level of document versus another, what is adequacy at a high level for the programmatic document.
Right.
So, yeah, and I think the answer is universal depending on which detail we're referencing.
Yeah, well, there is quite a bit in the document itself on that topic, and
Yes.
we might, because I think what's in the document speaks to how the team viewed that, and we need to go back to, is it chapter 2? There's
It is chapter 2.
a couple of pages where there's some pretty precise language that was included on that issue, and I think that speaks to where the team was coming from as they crafted the document and differentiated between what could be analyzed at basically the statewide scale versus what would be analyzed at the project level. Anyway, it's in there, and it's helpful. I mean, I certainly couldn't say what it said, but I do know that, I read through it pretty carefully at the time, and we could also go back to that. And I actually think that council needs to that's a part of the document where that's laid out, that we really need council to review that portion of the document. That specific portion of the document to see, to give us an opinion on whether that is a valid rationale for the way it was broken down.
Mm-hmm.
If I may, I do know that Board Council has read significant parts of the Vtpeir and does have some specific recommendations for revising the document to address some tiering concerns that he had, and so I'll bring any other comments you make, of course, on this. I can bring to him and make sure that and ask him to put together something for the September meeting. So this is already something he's planning on addressing with you. So. Unless there's more comments on that, and I think someplace that would be, I guess we'll say interesting for the board to start at, that I don't think would get us too hung up by not having council here, would be to start with the comments on program scope and content, starting on page 27. Because responding to these comments is going to require the board to make. There's some decision points in here that I think you can make without necessarily board council being available.
Yeah.
And I think just generally is a good discussion topic.
Back up one level from program. So I agree, that's the need of a lot of this, but just back to program necessities, where we had just a short number of comments, which I think is sort of the existential question that we're facing.
Yeah, so that starts on page 25.
Yeah.
Yeah. And program objectives follows that. Yeah.
Page
25.
tell me where we justify the program in the actual report? So I
I
can
think
compare it.
it's actually in the very first section.
Purpose and need.
Yeah, it would be necessity.
Urban sprawl and fragmentation of the landscape. 35 million people scattered.
Yeah. And so the essence of those, looking at this, there's the community San Luis Valley, which basically said, essentially, we'd be better served if a PT didn't exist. Looking at it from the standpoint of that our county and others, which I think gets at this, it's the necessity of having a document for the whole state is being on there. And I think our justification had been that some of the background here for this document was designed to reduce the overall cost of project level analysis. Some of this analysis could actually be done at the state level and it need to be replicated at the project level. And so I'm fairly comfortable with saying the necessity for this was the hypothesis that we could actually pull together information that would facilitate program level review and get it to focus on the actual issues that were truly relevant.
Yeah, I support that. And plus, it was, I think, intended as a better way to approach the cumulative impact of the entire.
Right. Well, cumulative impacts would have to add up the projects.
Right, and it's much better covered in a programmatic way.
And I think I thought this was a good place to start with. We would be better off from our point of view locally if this overarching didn't exist. And I thought, well, if we feel that there's value in putting together, overall what is the impact of the program, and assembling some of the information that you would rely on to analyze any project, then I would say no, I don't agree with this council. We would be better off that did some of this background collection material and looked at collectively all of these programs in a coordinated manner, and that allowed the local level review to focus on issues of how are you going to engage in the local community, what are their concerns, what are the local endangered species or threatened species, and there are things which are inherently local in the analysis that you can't do with the programmatic level. Say, cumulative impacts of a wide variety of programs like this, which are truly cumulative, like coalition, but also sort of setting the framework for a local engagement that dealt with local issues and strongly supported local engagement at the project level. So that kind of question of necessity, I'm quite comfortable saying our response is basically as we summarized there, and I think that actually comes through in a variety of these concepts. But I would start this way: it's categorized as necessity, that things under other categories.
Yeah, that'll certainly help us address many comments.
Yeah. So, any thoughts on that? Am I kind of summarizing the feeling of the board there? And then the second comment under necessity, which was from the same community, and in fact, the third one, which is from a different organization, in some ways they're about whether or not the existing mechanisms of governance for these activities, which is the comment from municipal exemptions, CAL FIRE's commitment to those exemptions and standing crews, exemptions are an issue. And, we do hear this across the state, that there's some concern that too much activity on the ground is being treated under exemptions. And while I do feel that's a valid question about state policy in general, in part, I think the amount of activity we're seeing under exemptions right now is because we are actually in a state of emergency where we are trying to facilitate some actions from the government help. This is Santa Cruz, but that's not the issue. But I'm not sure, as I read that comment about the necessity for this, it felt to me like, in fact, this was making the case that we're trying to come up with a non-exemption kind of framework to do things. And so the necessity for the program in part is to have a framework which is adequate to deal with the vegetation treatment needs of the state. Any comments from the board members? Are you reading that second comment the same way I am? I understand the concern, but in fact, it called to me the need for such a document, not calling into question the need for such a document.
Otherwise, it's not a program that's going to have our response to conditions.
The first comment seems like it's really criticizing a totally different program. So, right?
It is.
It's actually not even really
Not
part of
this one.
Yeah, so that is an issue. But yeah, I don't think that comment is helpful for this particular program.
Right.
The second one sounds like it's more, third, I guess.
Yes.
It's more around working with other agencies and actual implementation, it sounds like.
And I think, it is an admonition to collaboration and to do well by the land. So in that sense, yes, the collaboration across the agencies is great. I'm not sure what the specific criticism of a lack of collaboration is here. There are obviously differences in the mandate of the agency, so that the policies, especially at the state and federal level, in many of these areas, we like them to articulate as well as they can, but the agencies are responding to different agency mandates, different revenue streams, different constraints in those revenue streams, different levels of authority to engage in different kinds of government. You're dealing with land that is not owned by the agency or owned by we trust the country by the agency. You have to collaborate across the boundary. We're not expecting perfect consistency between, say, U.S. Forest Service or the other is the problem, just an affirmation that, yes, collaboration is important, but I'm not sure that there's an actionable thing other than to say that we agree with this. In your reading of the document, if you feel that there was a lack of coordination of state and federal policy, I feel like it's a problem in general. I know there's a specific problem with the document.
I think you just take a look at the project scale analysis and the requirements to complete the project. You see a cooperation almost to a fault at some points of the Air Resource Board, or the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Regional Water Board, the Cal Fire. Everybody got their piece, including what they felt was necessary to protect the environment. So there seems to be some level of cooperation.
I didn't feel like there was a deficit of collaboration here.
No.
And so then documenting our response to this may simply be a documentation of which agencies were consulted and provides comments on that, sort of moving forward that we have responded to those. So at a high level, I mean, this is a statement that we're doing what I thought we were doing. Okay, so maybe from that, if we've gone from program necessity, we would move to, we can go to scope and contents, but I actually think that the brief categorization of the objectives, if we say there's a reasonable case for necessity, why did we do it? What were we trying to accomplish after feeling that we actually were better off attempting to come up with a programmatic EIR, assuming that is possible.
That's ask
Yeah, go ahead.
Was that all the information you need, that conversation, for you to be able to write these responses?
At the moment, yeah. As we go through to start actually developing them, and then, I'm sure we'll come back and say, okay, we need. But yeah.
So then you'll come up with like responses to 1, 2, and 3, the last ones, and then we'll look at that again, or you'll just.
No, I'm not going to have like a draft response for you for like the next meeting.
No,
eventually what'll happen is we'll take all of these letters, we'll sort them and give all we'll say, we'll paraphrase everything that you all talked about as a response. Yeah.
Yeah, which is why it's important that you jump in now if one of us is going down the line that you're not certain about, and have some reservations. Jump in and say, at least I need to work on that one a bit more till I'm there. Because sometimes we'll be able to move forward and progress through by consensus, and sometimes we're going to come back to this a couple times. Remember,
just to build off Mark's question and your answer, you think you'll use the same format? So you have this nicely formatted.
No.
Okay.
Because and I can send out to the board members. Maybe like a final EIR for a statewide programmatic, so you could see and what it'll look like. But we'll reprint the letters, and then you kind of like organize. You give each letter a name, much like we do with a final statement of reasons. You give each letter or each part of a letter an identifier, and I'll write a blurb responding to it, or say where any changes might have been made, and then that's where you can also go. If people just wrote, I support the Chaparral Institute's letter, we would say, see response to. So it would look much more like the way we respond to comment in a final statement of reasons that it would in something like this.
The same response matrix, similar to this, where you have what you have right here, then maybe next column over would be.
Yeah,
I like kind of what you said.
I think our responses would be significant enough that it would end up with just really wonky formatting and stuff. So.
So long pages,
right?
Multiple pages with something only in one column.
Right. Yeah. Basically.
Okay.
Basically.
So let me just, with that in mind, then the first comment that you summarized was around this community of San Lorenzo Valley,
Mm-hmm.
basically saying they could do a better job than the state, right? So that local control would be better, could better manage their resources than the state. That's kind of what this implies.
Well, it would just. Yeah.
Well, you're not thinking that?
No.
Okay.
But
what are you thinking?
it's I think
if
he's.
I agree or not,
I think they.
That's the comment saying.
Are you looking at 058?
Well, yes.
Okay. I think that they're saying that the state flora would be better managed if we withdrew this proposed programmatic EIR. I don't think it's saying anything about who would do it better. It's just saying it would be better off without the board.
Okay.
I think actually it's a statement that from a local perspective, they're speaking of theirs, but they're implying that other people speaking from a different local perspective in different areas would feel they would be better off without a state document overarching process, which affected different locales. So I do think it's about it. Yeah. In my locale, I say I'd rather not have a state-level document that affected my interaction on this subject with anyone engaged in vegetation treatment. And I think other regions would agree with, is precisely, and our motivation that we had said in the draft that we released was that we felt that there was a level of analysis that was sufficiently broad around the possible treatments, that some of that analysis could be done at the level of the state and drawn upon at the local level, and that from the state's point of view, only dealing with projects at a local level without any framework in which those projects are integrated to look at cumulative impacts across the state would not serve the state's interest. And so I think it's
yeah,
right.
And I just want to add that there already is a state oversight process through CEQA. So what we're trying to do is actually give the local more power to actually do something on a local level. So
yeah, good point. And we'll have to go back and check those things, because in the end, while it's wonderful that we have board staff to summarize some of these comments, these responses are in essence, they're our comments. They're not they're not the staff, they're the board. So we have to take ownership of that. Good. So if we then go to the objectives, I need new glasses. For sure, we need bigger font, right?
I got yelled at that by Gabe a lot already.
So we were going to just briefly look at, so we looked at necessity, we're looking at objectives, and then that kind of feeds from there.
Page 26.
And I'm not sure
Because scope depends on your objectives.
And Chairman, I'm not sure if it's just a typo or if it's appropriate, but on the following page 27, the very first one, it says program necessity.
Yeah, I don't know how that one got
So I don't
swapped.
know what that is.
So that's that other hand that goes in the alphabet in a different place.
No. So I don't know if that is that what you intended to be necessity or is that actually a programming objective.
I think it's probably supposed to be program necessity, and when I was
Just got sorted.
right,
So
yeah.
you want to maybe
Good.
hit that one.
Absolutely. Good catch. And so, past comments is one of the things, which is another category.
You'll notice, and I think this happens in this comment, there are some commenters who at least appear to be confused about the scope of the program in terms of what would actually be treated per year under. So, Ms. Paul, for example, to recommend lunar landscape be approximately 1/4 of the state, which is not actually really what. So there are some comments that we can respond to just with a greater, clarifying the program.
Yeah, so it's an inaccurate characterization of the scope of the program in terms of number of acres.
0.2%.
Right.
So I don't know how much time we need to spend on that comment.
Yeah, so I think we can move on.
Well,
Go ahead.
well, we do have this comment apparently came before, right?
Well,
The claim.
this person may have written in before, yes, but this is a fresh letter.
Right, I get it. And, just in terms of process, we want to make sure that we actually address that and say, we did receive that comment. Here was our first comment, and now here's our second comment on this comment. Just to make sure that this person gets that we're trying to do diligence on making sure all the comments are reflected.
Yes, yeah, and that's on your disk is copies of if someone incorporated a letter by reference. That it's one of their older letters. To the extent that that letter is still available, it's on that disk. Yeah.
Okay. This, I think, is one of the more pervasive Well, I feel it's a misperception of what this thing is, which is basically 22 million acres and extensive tree habitat. It simply is not what the plan is proposing. So I think this one, in that sense, so, program objectives, we've got primary objectives is to map the, and so in this case, you could say what are its objectives, and this notion of coming up with the characterization of fuel loading or mortality. In fact, I feel this is not the scope of this. This was supposed to be, this is a programmatic EIR, it's a planning framework that should be based on best available science, but it is not an investigation to determine where projects should be implemented. Right? So I do feel that's not one of the objectives of the program is to engage in the discovery process of where these activities should take place. And that may, in fact, come back if the rest of the board feels that way. That may, in fact, in part deal with some of the detail issues here in terms of what is the objective of this document in terms of both the specific of the program. So this is way over into the project level and prioritization of the things that we should do.
But this gets at your first comment around that umbrella, what the state may, in terms of cumulative impacts and things like that, then the state would have a role to maybe not pitch specific projects, but come up with priorities in different parts of the state.
Yes, but in this sense, we haven't said that this document is supposed to be the prioritization document. It's for us to have projects which are kind of coming out of unit plans or community welfare protection plans. And so we've actually deferred a lot of that to the local area. I think it is incumbent on resources agencies to do the kind of work that's going to be reported to us in the first item on our hearings tomorrow, which is kind of the assessment of mortality coming out of Forest Service work. So that's a separate role, but it's not necessarily a purpose in my mind.
I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Oh, I understand.
So if the state is going to claim that we need a programmatic EIR, then you could assume that the programmatic EIR would have some sort of prioritization process of how the actual project.
So is the statement of necessity not adequate if we're not? So is there an adequate documentation of the mortality and fuel loading and fire danger in the document?
Well, I'm not sure you can drill down to that specific issue is what I'm getting at. Because it may change in 2 years, maybe a different issue, right? So
exactly. That's why I
document. But I guess what I'm wondering is if the state is claiming, if we are claiming that we need a statewide program, what's the, then we're going to just let all the local jurisdictions figure out what they're going to do, then what's the really value of the statewide program?
I think two things. One is setting the framework for justification of the process, and making sure that the local actions add up to something which is reasonable for us to understand.
Without any, I just worry that if you go to the target, so by the state not coming up with what the targets are, what we're measuring, and anything that happens on the ground where the claim is part of our program but is not adding up to anything useful, we're just sort of adding projects up or bottom up and saying, okay, well, see, with all the stuff we did, but it really isn't programmatically hitting a target that struggle with this, because I think at the local level they probably are hitting with great targets, but at the state level we may be not justifying the programmatic
Try to get at these.
Well, I think you're questioning whether or not 60,000 acres distributed across the allowable vegetation treatments actually significantly checks. Sue, what's the word of that objective? Is the one that you work with the most.
Right.
To significantly reduce.
The extent and effects, I can't remember exactly, but it's the objective that says that if you do 60, that the objective is to do enough treatment that you affect fire regimes, and the amount of, we had a lot of discussion on this.
Yes.
It is, yeah, and it was, and we've been through this a lot, that perhaps 60,000 acres is enough, but most of the comments are focused on that 60,000 acres is too much in terms of the impacts that it's going to have. And many of the comments are focused strictly on the amount of treatment that's going to be done in Chaparral, which is only a relatively small part of the total acres that is projected for treatment. But we get, there was a lot of discussion over whether the amount of treatment was sufficient to make any changes. But most of the comments are focused on the amount of treatment being too much and causing too much damage. So it's interesting, on the perspectives that people have. Can I explore that a little bit with Edith on how this stuff is categorized? I do think that the board should look at where the comments are coming from. The letters have addresses, so we can see. The emails, it's harder to tell where the people actually live. I do think if we find that almost all the comments are coming from a subset of California, and we talked about this too, that we could pursue making some remedies that address those concerns of the people. If almost all the comments are coming from Southern California, and that's where the concerns are in terms of potential damage to the environment, because there is so much build out and there is a huge impact on biodiversity there. We know that already because of on private land. And we have very few comments, either positive or negative, from the rest of the state. There are some implications about how the board could pursue that, and it is hard from looking at, because I was starting to tally the comments to see if they were all coming from, there's an awful lot of them from San Diego and the Santa Monica area, and very few from the rest of the state, as far as I can tell. I think, again, we need to try to, if most of the focus that's negative about the plan is coming from one area of the state, maybe we can try to make some modifications. And that's something I suggested. Yeah.
But these are both 170 and 171 are from that area.
Mm-hmm.
In response to 170, why isn't the primary objective to map this stuff? Part of it is, what is the nature of this document? And the other is, actually, other agencies are already doing this. Right? So, kind of, it's there. Other people have this responsibility. It's an ongoing thing. It's not a focus. I sort of felt the same on 171 in a way that I feel there are factual misstatements here. This is not the document which is advocating a lot of error. And in fact, why isn't the primary objective, one of the primary objectives, to preserve watershed health? And in fact, this is a draft vegetation treatment program in Union, which is about the fire aspects, but with due concern for all environmental impact. And so it's not a watershed plan. The watershed concerns are certainly treated in the evaluation here, but from my point of view, this doesn't mean the fact that we are Californians, we all care desperately about water, we care about accessibility, we care about hazards like this. That doesn't mean that the water deal becomes a primary objective of a research treatment program. There may be consequences. The plan, as we presented here, would have to deal with those consequences, but it doesn't necessarily elevate it to an objective in something which is designed to make a different problem, right? And so I think this becomes something that is to treat adequate of the concerns, and in fact the characterization of this is a bare earth policy is decided based on this category. So yeah, I agree. Also,
one other
go ahead.
comment. One thing about that, it does work, and I understand why you did this, Edith, where there is a very long letter, and the letters are divided into sections, and the sections about program objectives. But there is, we're going to have to read the whole letters in a lot of these cases because they're actually, when taken out of context, they have a really different, and we're just reading these sections. When taken out of context, sometimes we're misinterpreting what the meaning is without the context. And you did caution us on that in the beginning, that we should really read the whole letters. And that is certainly true with some of these, like the Native Plant Society comments, because those are extensive. And these paragraphs, in context with the other things that the Native Plant Society said, these comments make a lot more sense than taking them as individual standalone paragraphs.
Yeah. Can I add to that?
Sure.
So, I agree. I have my sleeves rolled up. I'm ready to go through the however many number of comments there are.
150.
Last time. But I would hate for us to miss the message that I received in reading approximately 1/3 of the actual letters. And that message was, you need to do something more about how you're managing chaparral. Either explain it better.
Oh, yeah.
We either need to explain it better. It's not a slash and burn in the document, or we need to change how we're doing it where there is some validity. And then the WUI was the other thing that kept popping up.
That will eat level of detail. But that's why, and that is the major part of the overarching discussion. Yeah, I just thought, why are we doing this and what are our objectives? Because they were small and at high levels when you spend a half an hour digging through those. Because you're right, those three elements are the overriding consideration.
That's what I want to capture those three. I think we got to capture those three. We got to address them sincerely and honestly.
Yeah.
And then while we do the exercise of legally, we have to respond to each one of these things.
That's right.
But those are.
But just if I'm talking about what has to be in there, I've got to say, if I've got comments about what the objectives are, since the whole document follows from the necessity to do it the objectives, that's just the reasons are just at that level. A lot of the other stuff bends out different ways, but the issue, as opposed to the categorization of the issue, the actual underlying issue, whether it's in the analysis of scale or the ecological values, revolves around those issues.
Yeah. And the other one,
basically, it's an alternative organization to this, which is sort of a categorical statement as opposed to an issue statement. Right. It's based on the underlying issue as opposed to the nature of the issue. And this is the nature of the issue.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, so the fourth one, the pace. I just thought it interesting. We spent a lot of time, Mark, talking about pace and scale and concerns that this was a drop in the bucket, wasn't going to address the catastrophic fire conditions and the burning. But what I read in a lot of these letters was environmental damage. Every acre that you treat is that many more acres of environmental damage, and so it's a lot of the other thing trying to rectify that.
I just wanted to just briefly deal with this last objectives which, because I felt it was a good example of some of these, and they are pointing out that what is a statement of fact is in fact not a statement of all possible facts, is the way I would read this. So, where you have native oaks, treatments may incorporate retention of older acorn-producing oaks to provide year growth. That is, in essence, it's a statement of fact in law. But as they're pointing out, there may be other reasons to retain oak, like the deer retention. And so this becomes an issue in terms of the level of detail in a document like this as to whether or not we are expected to provide all of the reasons that one might want to retain oaks in the landscape. And those regions, those reasons are their name is legion. It's a rather long list, I'm sure. Member Barber has written me 10 off the top of his head, but is the failure to state those impairing the document that we're preparing by not having these cases. And that was my reaction to this, and some of you may react to this differently, because it does get to the level, I understand what's categorized as objectives, so why would you vote? Well, you have a lot of reasons you would vote. In this case, because it's not a wildlife management document, but it's talking about fire-related vegetation treatment programs, which have implications for vegetation, has implications for, as the previous comment, watershed wildlife management. We're not actually documenting all the vegetation philosophy of the state, or any more here than you would get into silvicultural considerations as to why we might want to underplant pine or something. So I felt it's an absolutely true statement as the comment. I'm not sure how the board feels about this, but in terms of the scope of the document, if you're making all statements related to the management action, that it becomes a very standard document. I guess I'm looking to those of you that do these kinds of documents more often as opposed to my background. I think at least 4 of you have some direct experience with this.
The brief comment I'll make is, I don't think we're required to exhaustively explain why every reason that you want to say no. On the other hand, if there's conflicting reasons or disagreements among experts, we do need to disclose that one person says we should save oaks, and the other person says we shouldn't save oaks for fighting fire. Maybe we believe as the board we should save oaks, but we should disclose the other perspectives in there because that's part of NEIR is to bring out. So this one's different. It's just saying you didn't cover all the reasons.
Right. So in the context of something like our trying to promote oak woodland restoration.
Yeah.
Right. So there, I can understand why we would deal with a bunch of those issues.
I guess I'm like Member Miles in a little way, is that I mean, if you start expanding the document, you always ask the question, well, where are we going to stop? But if it is to answer a public concern, if it matters just adding some substantive sentences to add, I don't see the harm there. No. But I do, it is a slippery slope. But it seems like we do have in our goals is to have as they point out, a healthy and diverse native plant community. I mean, those are overarching goals of this document. So I don't see why we couldn't reiterate those comments in those sections with respect to these. So I think that would be an easy change to make.
Okay. Good. So this is a good example of how we would want to respond. In this case,
I think in this case, I think would be to recognize that, hey, that it does link with goals we've already stated in the document. Oh, by the way, this is how we think we're going to do it.
Okay, so we can then take another category and think about program skills. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's that one more about, that might end up being covered as we go through the program scope and contents questions,
Yeah, I'm
though.
not sure we're going to directly make that transition to the first sentence go.
We're talking about the Paul Lori comment?
No.
Peter's saying
Peter's
clear.
saying clear.
Yeah.
The only reason to undertake production of treatment beyond the principal source boundaries would be to consider the sources. But that does not appear to be for an objective. And so it's also possible less effective use of conserving sources. So this gets at the heart of, we have to summarize what the issue here is. This is the one that goes all the way back in the National Fire Plan debate and so forth, which is the allocation of management action in direct protection efforts around infrastructure or in support of public safety relative to the value of activities taking place farther away. And so this was the debate that we dealt with at some length in our Southern California discussion of board member comments, which was revolving around the questions of the kind of ecological restoration objectives is what I would characterize this comment as relating to. It was the rationale for actions that are merely different.
Yeah, I think this one's pretty simple, and it is one of the stated objectives is to protect wildlife and natural resources from catastrophic wildfire and ecological restoration in the state. Many places.
I feel this, whether or not it's like, yes, that's in there, depends on your interpretation of what conserving resources mean. And I actually felt that, in fact, conserving resources is identified there. Although there are some other issues when it says only, there are other issues. We are dealing with things like the public health impacts of particulate matter. So there are other things, but so I think I wouldn't interpret this as saying we need to throw away the other reasons, but we could respond in part that in fact the rationale of conserving resources is well articulated in the ecological restoration activities, which are not rule-based. Is that right? And I thought that was a good one to bring up in terms of objectives, because there are these other objectives, and conserving resources didn't feel maybe do justice. In a way, it's the notion that there's this artificial division when you move away from home in terms of the impact on public safety and public health. Nothing is really remote in an air quality management district. Okay. So that puts us through kind of the necessity and the objectives. Do we want to jump somewhere else, or did you want to back off and have a little bit of a board discussion just dealing with the issue of these overall levels of how you reacted to the questions about detail, how you reacted to the questions about the regional dimensions and the high concentration comment from shelter region, or
Well, I had one other comment on creating a response to many of these comments, two different things. One would be reiterating what CAL FIRE is responsible for and what they're not, because there's an awful lot of comments about how CAL FIRE should focus on basically things that are outside their scope, which is, although CAL FIRE encourages people to, cover their saw beds and put away their wood pile and, use non-flammable roofing materials, the cities and counties are the ones that are responsible for the building codes. And I think we need to have some language that explains that, of course, CAL FIRE and the board think it's very important that homeowners either build or retrofit their homes so that they can resist wildfire, and that is happening all over the state. It's not something that CAL FIRE could make an objective of this plan because it's outside of the scope. Because there are lots of comments, and actually there's one coming right up from the California Chaparral Institute that basically says that CAL FIRE should have focused on that. So if we could craft some language, to answer that.
Yeah, so
and
I think this is, let me jump in,
yeah.
because I think you're really onto something that's important about part of a response we will need to call on again and again, and that is a statement as to the scope of the activities that CAL FIRE or the other agencies that would be looking at this would be looking at in vegetation treatment, and that our role here, given that this is sort of our programmatic area, a statement as to the safety element activity we do, as to our role in 4290, but also a disclaimer as to our role with respect to local building codes, right? So what is within the scope of authority that we're dealing with and what is beyond the scope and in effect under state or local controls. So, and I think a well-written delineation of what is in and what is not in our authority on those topics would be really useful, and we're going to call on it again.
So my guess is the frustration for like someone like CMBS would be, you're just passing the buck, instead of really dealing with where the sources of fires are. Now we're losing more biodiversity. Right? That would be the concern.
Well, it's really mixed because in some parts of the state, and if you look at the responses we got back from the science group, they were really focused on aligning the vegetation treatment program with natural processes and natural fire regimes. And what comes out and is true is that fire is way too frequent, and chaparral communities in Southern California specifically are so impacted by urbanization and invasion of plants. I mean, we've seen it that they also looked at that side of it, the too much fire versus not enough fire. But I don't think it's passing the buck because CAL FIRE truly is not responsible for local building codes. We need to say that we are in full support of fireproofing houses and making them more resistant to fires and designing fire-safe communities, but that this particular document doesn't address that. Then the second thing,
and following on what you're saying, I'm sorry to go just real quick, but the notion that I think the document that we're talking about here is nuanced enough to point out that there are parts of the state where we have too much disruption, and there are parts of the state where we have suppressed the natural disruption cycles. We have both situations, and characterizing the state as being in one situation or the other is simply not supported by the evidence that we have.
Yeah. Well, and the second part of this, where there are comments about you should do these things everywhere, we need to keep coming back to what's true about the area that this EIR covers, and that it's private land.
Right.
And many of these comments are written as though it's not. A lot of these comments are written as though we're talking about the Forest Service or a national park, where you do end up with much more latitude to develop strategic field treatments. You may not have the money, but you can do the treatment than an area that's being managed that's made up of a whole bunch of individual private holdings. So I think that's another sort of piece of language that we need to really think about how we craft, and so that it'll make it, because there's a lot of commonality. I mean, many of the letters have similar themes.
Yeah, that's actually very important. I think that is in the same vein as my statement about sort of community safety elements versus building codes. The issue of we need to make sure that the different public, right? That the same management on all public lands, that different public agencies actually have different missions in kind of their organic organization and direction, so the management will not always focus on public lands, or it would actually be in violation of the authority under which they're operating, mission activities.
True, but we are really crafting.
But this one's for private.
Yeah, this is. I just want to say we are crafting a document to try to help private landowners do work on their private land. That's the whole purpose of this, and to make it in a strategic way that will make sense, and where there's and so a lot of these comments don't seem to acknowledge that that private landowners should have some ability to do projects. That's why there's so much focus on individual projects in terms of the mitigation, because you're dealing with individuals who are proposing individual projects.
Right, or communities.
Or communities,
projects
right.
which affect multiple private owners.
Well, and I just want to be clear, so we're not only talking that we need Edith to craft a response that we can then use strategically to answer questions we think that are appropriate.
Yeah.
But to me, it sounds like, because people, they might read response to questions, but they're actually going to probably go back to the main document again. It seems like fairly early in the document there needs to be this disclaimer almost of talking about. Well, it needs to be.
Well, like 99.9% sure that statement's in there, but that doesn't mean people.
You're touching on the reality of people reviewing documents that are 300 pages long. Right? They got a letter from somebody, or they read parts of it.
Yeah.
It's important for us to go through and say your concern is addressed on pages A, B, C, and G.
Well, that's the nature of the responses, isn't it? In fact, it's not simply a statement; it's a reference to specific treatment in the document.
And it's two distinct different things. One is if they found pages A, B, C, and D and they had concerns about those, then you respond one way. If they raise concerns but they didn't know about that, then you just bring that to their attention. Probably half the comments didn't find pages A, B, and C, and just referencing them. That's actually staff can do a lot easier and better than us using our time trying to do that. So, I'm sorry to do that.
No, I guess I just refer to EIF question. So you think it's adequate in the document itself that you can just reference pages about this discussion we've had about kind of our role in this?
Although I could tell you a lot about what the document contains, I couldn't necessarily tell you off the top of my head the depth to which the document goes into it.
Yeah.
So what we would do is go back and look at those sections, look at how we discuss, where these projects are taking place on private lands, private landowners, and either bring it back to you and say, these are the sections we found, do you think they're adequate? Or amongst ourselves say, okay, yeah, this definitely needs work, or okay, no, this is sufficient. So we'll have to kind of reference them and review it again and think about whether or not we consider it adequate.
But we know that.
But we know it's
we're
in
going to have
right.
to craft some kind of response to the general public versus private land nature of some of these questions. And so doing the background work to find those sections, but I'm also trying to surface a few of these because I'm sure, I'm going to struggle through the entire document again, informed by this discussion. And I want some highlights in my head so that certain parts are jumping out.
So I'm going to say it again because I don't think I said it very clearly. I don't mean pass the buck, but I think that organizations that are caring about biodiversity are frustrated that biodiversity is the first thing we throw under the bus when we're trying to do some sort of land use change or hazard reduction. And I think that by trying to push Board of Forestry not to adopt this and to say, if you're not highlighting that you don't actually have jurisdiction over the real sources of fire transmission in urbanized areas in Southern California, maybe house roofs, I'm not sure. But then you're really not dealing with the trade-off in an appropriate way. And I think that's, for me, that's where I'm, and then I read did you guys see the prompt that a lot of the Chaparral Institute sent to people?
Yes.
It's completely blown in terms of where they start from. 22 million acres, we're going to
No, I saw
it.
Some of the individual
state parks is going to be, it's like it's bizarre. But and if you're listening, shame on you. But the other side of it that I do think is compelling is that biodiversity has such a low value economically, especially in these really highly urbanized areas, that they're frustrated that removing any constraints on private landowners to be able to remove more land. And, I guess I remember growing up with some advertisement of plant ice plants all around your house in Southern California. I think it was Dick Van Dyke did these advertisements. And I still remember it. Oh, nice! And you can still see this, So it's just, I can sort of sympathize with this concern that in the distinction between Southern California chaparral and the rest of the state, I think is super important. And maybe not exempt, but a different format or a different approach for that region, for those regions. I don't know.
So what we've offered today is that we flat out just don't have the jurisdiction.
Well,
over the building codes. I mean, that's where you're saying where all the ignitions are coming from. Okay, huh?
I don't know what ignitions come from. So,
but I mean, that's the claim, right?
Yeah, right.
And that's the frustration,
right?
So,
well, no, actually, we know where ignitions come from. In general, what is it? In most urban areas, the number of fires of unknown origin is probably no more than 25-30%. So you have a pretty good feel for the others, and you can get a breakdown. And there's a reason why a map of ignitions on the kind of places that CAL FIRE responds to is, if you stand far enough back from it, and like a county level ignitions map, it looks like the road network with the recreation sites added. Right? You see the highlights, which are the recreation areas, and especially around water, where people tend to recreate in higher numbers, and you can name the roads. And so the human ignition causes are off the charts, and we have to get up into some other areas before lightning becomes a significant area. And there's parts of the state where we know from the lightning detection system where that's a big cause. So we do know it's people, and I think I'm kind of getting to where you're at there, Mark, in the sense of we have, as I said, the whole state's not the same, and I don't think this document is trying to make it the same. And I think what frustrates me about the rhetoric is that some people are trying to say this is a one-size-fits-all solution, when in fact the analysis, I don't think, is saying that the Sierra, the North Coast, Chaparral, Central, or even coastal chaparral inland systems is the same. And We do have to recognize in all these comments that there are valid concerns about loss of biodiversity because of fundamentally a feeling which I think has some scientific validity that we're in a disruption ecology system in most parts of the state, and in some places the disruption cycle is overwhelming the system's resilience, right? And so if there's a loss of biodiversity resulted from this anthropogenic load that's being thrown at it, is this program going to help, or is it going to exacerbate that? And in fact, I think my read of what we were trying to do was it should actually help. The objective is that when communities pick stuff, yes, they have a protection objective, but they may well also have, I need something which is going to prevent, too frequent a reburning of a fire into an area where I feel the fire cycle has gotten too short, right? And so we have to highlight that. And I don't feel like the public rhetoric has understood what I felt we were trying to do here, which is actually empower some very finely nuanced stuff and to move it forward until you can really focus on some of those issues. And that there could be a selection or prioritization at a level in these counties where the objectives could be very, very different in different parts of the state based on whether or not this is a problem of we've got a buildup versus this stuff is burning beyond the return interval at which the resilience is there. And, so if the document doesn't convey that, then it isn't properly structured. But I had felt the document when I read it all the way through did convey that, and so that was part of my frustration. But assuming all of the responses aren't merely strategic responses, then we all have to look at the comments to make sure that in fact we are providing that sort of capacity for nuanced analysis that doesn't make people that are concerned primarily about a loss of biodiversity from urbanization and attendant fire danger and other features of urbanization, right? I mean, the colleagues that have done some pretty neat work on the effects of cats, which comes with urbanization, right?
So is this like the last one, is that if the team feels like there's some information already existing in the current Vtpeir that would address some of the concerns Los Huertos is bringing up, we're hoping they can find those and bring them to our attention. Because that's where I'm kind of at, was like, I think what we need to do, if we can, is highlight where those are. That we share the concern. We share this concern. Yeah. Hey, there's this ignition source out there. We are doing what we can when safety elements come before us.
Right.
But that's our limited role.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't mean we're ignoring it. Just realize that that's just not our jurisdiction. There are other comments that we've gotten. It seems like everybody wants this one size fits all, and we're all seeing, all being for everything in the state, and that's just not the case. That's not what this is. Mm-hmm. This is a vegetation treatment program. So
which can look very different in different places.
Right. So I don't know if that's a help enough, but it sounds like that's the theme of the day, is kind of what Mike started with. See if there are places the team can find in the document to kind of bolster that claim. Because
and this, like you're saying,
we can't solve the problem.
This is not our entire fire strategic plan.
Right.
This is a vegetation treatment plan. Well, we have a fire strategic plan. We have and there's these other documents. Maybe we need to disclose that up front when there's more going on than just the.
And we've got an EMC
plan. I don't think we realized that.
By the way,
since Zari and I are smiling at the thought of strategic because we had a discussion this morning about exactly what strategic means.
I don't know. I just remember we had some fire plan here a few years, and that kind of goes to some other areas.
Yes.
This, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
But we should reference. I guess we should reference that.
But I think it's part and parcel of the same thing, that are we doing an adequate job with biodiversity, and are we doing an adequate job in particular with some of the chaparral areas? They are the same question. Those concerns are not dominant in, say, areas of the state where Rich is spending his career, or where Mike is. These are really localized issues. So, the fact that there are local differences, though, to my mind, does not come into question whether or not a statewide program can or should exist.
Because shouldn't those concerns about biodiversity, they should be picked up in one of the 87 PSAs, or the project scale, not the PSAs, but the SPRs. And so I'd be interested, Mark, if you get a chance to look at the SPRs, they should have some that address preservation of biodiversity, see if you have enough mitigations built in, right? If you got the safeguards built in or not.
So that is important, and that would certainly be part of our response. Yeah, but I think it is incumbent on us to make sure we are comfortable that they are adequate and deal with those concerns.
And tied into the bioreach appropriately.
That's right. That's right.
Not as a one-size-fits-all.
Not as a one-size-fits-all. Now, when I was looking at something like in the chaparral community, do you have this? So it's very right. It was something specific.
Yeah. Okay. All right, guys. We've been at this for about 2 hours. Can we take a short break, and then we'll come back to it? Let's just 10 minutes. Okay. Let's bring the workshop back into session.
Well, that's what we're talking about.
And we're back. Okay.
And that's a good point. I mean, that's not even right.
Yeah. I think I have it, but I just don't know when they come up.
Okay, so we have gone through 2 of the sort of categories of comments, the necessity and the objective. I think identified some areas where we know that we're going to have to get some things we'll have to refer back to the part of our response. We've identified the general concern about biological diversity and the programmatic EIR does or does not take into consideration things like biodiversity loss or ecological benefits that may have a very more localized or regional aspect. We'll have to do some work to go through that cascade through the level of the estimate detail. We've got the CEQA, in particular, some of the tiering, recirculation, baseline, those sort of things, and detail that arguably would need some advice from council on. Do you want to pick up one of the themes that Member Miles identified and have a higher level discussion, or do you want to plow back in and do one of the categories like the alternatives, and jump in on something like that? So what's the board's pleasure as to how we move ourselves towards discharging our civic duty?
I think
Remember, Keith was not going to be a dictator.
alternatives analysis.
Yeah.
Okay.
You were 500.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like I'm watching Jeopardy here.
What page is that? Somewhere?
That starts on page 41.
So you know what Jeopardy changed. Dan Melly correctly. Look, you want a whole week back in the year when you couldn't stay up for a week. And made it back to the tournament. Interesting guy.
Who's this?
Lieutenant Dan Melly tends to go off at times and say, in old Irish, he expressed that as rhetoric one from. All right, so here we are.
So, members, sorry, did you have kind of a overarching theme that you thought, as opposed to going through these individual comments that may or may not have been taken in context? What you saw when you read that? Because I had arranged the alternatives analysis kind of was, when I read through some of these letters, was also an item that I felt like we needed to deal with. And just one way or another, come up with how, we agree with some of the comments, not agree.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. I mean, whether, one thing that we need to have to address, I think, is whether the range of alternatives that were looked at in the document, whether people had other alternatives they felt would work better, that kind of thing. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Because, I think that appears in many of the letters, that we may not have an adequate range of alternatives, and also that the program, or the selected alternative, basically, was not what they would have selected.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's the board after, our careful review of the whole program, and in what we're going to recommend as the chosen program. I mean, they can provide their comments, but ultimately we're going to have to decide, which one we recommend. But in an EIR analysis, I don't want to get us caught in a situation where we're not doing the breadth. And two things that came out when I reviewed them was that there was this theme in a lot of letters, and I thought they were well written and thought out, that somehow doing nothing was okay. And either we have to accept that doing nothing is okay, or we need to refute that one way or the other.
Well, that was one of the alternatives, right?
Yeah, but I think that's what maybe we need to strongly word a little better, because that obviously it kind of rings through many of the letters, that somehow we just go away and that's
the question of
acceptable
necessity.
It comes certainly back to a lot of
programmatic ER.
And so what I'm asking on the range of analysis is that on the existing alternative, either come back and say, no, team needs to come back and say, yeah, we think we've got this appropriately described, but it seems to me we don't have the potential negative effects of doing nothing. That's what it seems, because that's definitely, I didn't see anybody that in a single letter that described that situation, that was somehow an acceptable outcome. And yet they were several of that range. So that was the one thing when I read the whole range of analysis. And then there was the requests, and you can pick your distance. It kind of ranged a little bit, but having just the alternative, just doing the PRC code, just the defensible space, and that's all we should be recommending as an alternative. And what do we see as the downside for that, or the positives for that? If we had, to me it seems like we had the no action alternative better described or emphasized. Maybe it is well described, just emphasized. And then this other one in there, that would, because that was a theme that came through a lot. And without going through all these that are in front of us here, starting on page, whatever this is, 41. I don't know which ones, how those, but that seems like that's if we came up with a response or maybe modifications to the document to include that would address a whole. It seems like to me there would be a whole bunch of them that would be addressed. I don't know what the other board members think.
Just one thing on that, I think it's a good point that I found interesting was some of the comment letters seem to suggest these are not going to be effective working Evans Louis that goes so far out, putting strips. The adverse impacts on Chaparral is not going to be effective in preventing damage to the houses, and so why bother? It's not an effective way, and you're going to have this biodiversity effect. I guess in the no project alternative, what I found interesting was the reality of the fires are actually escaping the communities and the roads and burning into the chaparral and creating a loss of that evaluation right there of what is the effect if you don't protect the chaparral. I guess my comment goes off of your no project alternative would be one thing I might add.
Right. I mean, that's we were just having a conversation about this. I mean, that's what we have in the forest environment. It's only related to this subject, but that's what's flipped in our mind in forest management. Is we used to do shaded fuel breaks to keep fires from coming out of the forest and commercial forest and federal forest into small communities like Whitmore and Shingletown. That whole thought is totally flipped. It is to prevent or reduce the escapement of fires from out of these communities into the commercial forests. And that is very clear in why landowners are doing it. So I see this exactly the same way. That's why I was kind of thinking about that's what we're thinking about. Is I'm not really worried about the chaparral roaring down into these communities so much as it's the reverse. And I don't know, that was a sidebar conversation.
Well, remember we had, I think it was on one of those really long days, and I was probably going on and on, but we had a long discussion about why the team decided not to include the acres that were treated as part of the defensible space program in the total acres treated. And in some ways, I think the chickens have come home to roost because we didn't do that. And the reason we didn't do that, and it made sense to the team, and after a while, I guess it made sense to me. The reason we didn't do that is because the landowners are responsible for doing it by statute. They're responsible. Therefore, it shouldn't be included as part of the baseline. And that is probably true maybe in the numbers, but I think what happened as a part of de-emphasizing it is that it makes the vegetation treatment program look like it doesn't include defensible space. And there are treatments that are the responsibility of landowners. And we had another discussion about that today in the Resource Protection Committee. We had some community members come in. And I know, and some discussion with industry folks as well about how the big concern right now is that people have dead trees within defensible space. They are responsible and required to remove them, but they can't because they can't afford it, and there's no way that CAL FIRE can assist them because of the way the law is written, that it's their responsibility. But I do think that if we do consider making any changes, not necessarily should we include the acreage, of the 50 and the acreage, which I know when we talked about it with the team, it was too hard to estimate, and it was, we were going to have too much of a range because of parcel size and distance to fence lines and all that kind of stuff. But it does appear that it was lost on a lot of the people that are commenting that is a state requirement and that treatment is being done, and people are required to do it in SRA. So I think that's some of how we could respond. And even though it's de-emphasized to some extent, Edith, in the document, there is a section in there that talks about all the programs that reduce fire hazard that are not part of a vegetation treatment program. And it's in chapter, I forget the chapters, but you know where it's the no action alternative does include a whole
Oh.
section of all the things that are not the vegetation treatment program that do deal with. And it may be there that we can say that alternative that keeps coming up here is already covered. It's just maybe we didn't call it out, and we didn't include a number for it. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's not just individual public members. I mean, a couple of the, I guess these were academic and agency letters had them in there where they're pretty strongly that we should just be doing, I think they call it, the National Park Service was saying, just from the house out approach. You see that kind of terminology used a lot. Or from like UC Santa Barbara, it was like just only from the structure out to 100 feet, as if that wasn't even existing. So it has, I think, memory, sorry to really hit it somewhere, we lost. It's not, I mean, there's numerous people that probably had some background. I remember these people that they had some background in fire and they had lost that concept. So somewhere, again, it needs to be either emphasized better in the document. And along with the well thought out response to it.
So that's already occurring, required to happen, but it's not accomplishing the overarching goals of the state, right?
Right.
Well, it's not
That's a
part of
standalone.
this vegetation treatment program because it's, even if we didn't do this at all,
It's not-
it would still
yeah,
happen.
These are projects,
Right.
in essence. So, in a sense, it is the existence of this document and the non-existence of this document doesn't change the legal obligation to engage in this activity. And so I think we do need to make sure that in the know, if that's what we've got it, in the no action alternative, we're comfortable with what it says about what's going on there, and that's part of our response. But I do feel, but have you thought about, and sort of, well, that's there, but that's not this document. Was frequently my reaction to some of those comments, and they're valid comments, and I think it goes back to what Miles stating, in part we're dealing with the reality of people getting us a reaction to a 300-page document. Right? And sort of, where is that? And it's our job to make sure that it's clear and that we're responsible. I think there's another part of this, though, that in the alternatives, and I mean, I'm far from a sleeper and NEPA expert, but I did have at one point in my career more engagement with National Forest Management Act planning, which is certainly part of that. And I find the comments in here quite interesting on what constitutes alternatives. And they come at it from two very different directions, which are mutually exclusive as to what it is we should be following, or what's the right approach. There are groups that would say either the impact of sort of, if we were to do 60,000, this is completely inadequate, and that any reasonable set of alternatives would include something much, much larger. And we have a long discussion about what constituted a realistic expansion from a program which has struggled to achieve 20 to 30,000 acres on a yearly basis. And so I felt, and still feel very strongly, that a realistic set of alternatives has to include the administrative, political, and financial likelihood of a given level of treatment acres. And that challenging to go sort of what was realistically a bit above doubling the current program, much farther than that. And I felt we're all, absent a remarkable change in infrastructure and so forth, or the capacity to move this thing through, or it's available. It felt like it was a challenge that that was enough, and beyond that, I felt like I was being, if I wanted something bigger, I might want something bigger, but that I wasn't being realistic about what was a true feasible alternative. And so when I see remarks from some groups that we would need to have, several 100,000 acres a year to have, adequate set of alternatives, I'm saying I just don't see the rationale for starting from a point of something that I feel is a completely infeasible alternative. So it's not really part of the decision space. Right? So there's out there, and so I feel I can respond to that. We did have a fairly extensive discussion about the dimensions of what is an actual feasible alternative. And then there are criticisms that looking at what we had determined was a truly feasible expansion of activities that might be certified under such a programmatic EIR for the state vegetation treatment programs. We've got not just this what's administratively feasible, but what actually gets into air quality impacts that are direct under the way the Clean Air Act gets written. And the consulting report that we have makes the air quality impacts basically. So there's actually kind of a hard limit on some of this stuff as well. So I think we can say that our response has to be, what we thought was feasible. But within that, what we thought was, for a variety of reasons, whether they were environmental, like air quality, or administrative, or financial, that you might there at 60. There's some criticism that the alternatives are looking at different levels of application of the permissible tools that might be employed on the project level. And I frankly don't understand that criticism. That in fact, if we're talking about something about this big, you might employ different methods that would say you're focused more on treatments, kind of mechanical treatments, which might be close to home, or you're focused farther out. And that, to me, was actually responsive as a set of alternatives to map out what's the shape of the decision space for people that have this concern about, if nothing else, where would the activities take place? If we get away from the notion of just, there's part of it which is just kind of private property obligations on the physical space, but there's still more community level rules. And so I actually am not comfortable that those are valid criticisms of the cases. And I don't know how the rest of you feel about that, but maybe we should have a bit of discussion on that issue about kind of the set of alternatives, any one of which is not, in the kind of the NEPA planning I'm used to, we were always thinking about a set of alternatives as collectively defining a decision space, right? And what the program is actually doing needs to be in with the decision space, inside that decision space. What do you guys think about that part?
I don't disagree that it's got to be inside of the decision space. I guess I need some clarity then. So, and maybe this is from the team and how they viewed it when they did the analysis. So if I'm understanding back in the discussion here, is so since the 100-foot PRC code is not part of this, which we all know, was it part of the no alternative analysis? I'm guessing the answer is yes, but I want to hear that.
Give us a little background on that.
Like at
the existing program.
I mean, it's part of the no project analysis in that the current conditions would continue, but in terms of evaluating the environmental impact of it, Rachel would probably be,
Go for it. We do need bigger than
Explain things to us often and deeply.
So the no alternative takes off or begins if we do nothing, if we continue as a status quo. It does not take into account to CFIP. It does not take into account the PRC code. those things that are discussed in Chapter 1. It goes off of what we are doing currently, which is the status quo.
Meaning the VMP or?
Yeah, so the VMP, what the VMP is currently treating, which is under 30,000 acres a year, it evaluated based off what the status quo is as of right now.
So there's the VNP program,
Mm-hmm.
and that's underway without the benefit of anything other than, I guess, the chaperone management plan. You're right, there's no overarching programmatic EIR.
Right.
And
So the
no alternative is the continuation of the existing program without a programmatic component.
But when
Right.
it's done environmental or project by project environmental analysis.
Right, so it's a project by project. That's how we make it through the process. It does not take. It does not take into account the 100 feet dispensable space, the CFIP program, those things that are discussed in Chapter 1 that are outside the scope of the document.
Interestingly, it's less mitigated than the VTPIR when you go through the checklist. Would you agree with that? At least when I talked to CAL FIRE, they were like, you compare that checklist to the checklist we have here.
Our checklist is much more extensive, yes.
Yes.
But Rachel, do you think there's a way we could, because I don't know if you've been through the comments that we didn't talk about treating defensible space in the document. Do you think there's a way, even though we're not going to estimate the acres, and we could estimate the acres, or not, but to change the language so that people know that defensible space is going to be completed
regardless
whether
of
we do this or not.
I
And
think-
I think that's what they lost. If you look at the comments, people don't seem to know that.
Well, and I think the comments are also based off of one of the papers that was done through the Chaparral, or that the Chaparral Institute references a lot about that they believe that only 100 feet really has an impact. And I think that's really what a lot of those comments are referring to. But we can definitely beef up Chapter 1. We already expanded that section. We can expand it some more just to clearly point out these are happening regardless of what happens in this document, whether this document moves forward or not.
So
Good.
we could, which would, well, I think that's fine. Yeah, it's just that, and I think you're right that a lot of the comments are based on things not based on the document; they're based on people's interpretations of the document. So that's yeah. But we need to state. When we respond to the comments, we need to have some kind of language, whether it's in the document already or not, that clearly says, yes, defensible space is mandated by law in SRA, and CAL FIRE devotes a lot of, and local municipalities and contract counties devote a lot of their resources to inspections to ensure that defensible space is done every year, and it will happen. I don't know whether that just says that we're supporting the no action alternative. Mm-hmm. Whenever you call something a no action, it actually has a lot of action. It confuses people, and
But
that's how we.
That will occur under all.
That happens always.
Well,
yeah.
No, all alternatives will have that.
Right.
Defensible
That
space
component.
embedded in the background.
Check to make sure we're clear on that in the document, and it's part of the response to many of these statements too.
Yeah, and I think that we in Chapter 2.
For the record.
Drew Co, CAL FIRE. In Chapter 2, we explain a lot of that's where we explain the different vegetation treatments, and we kind of explain them in a spatially nested sort of way, and it really starts with that closest to the house sort of treatment. And so I think that we can bring some of that discussion of Chapter 1 into Chapter 2 within the framework of the larger program, and hopefully get the point across that way as well.
And I think I would add, if we're going to just again provide more emphasis there, not add a tremendous amount, but provide the appropriate emphasis, is also in this confusion, apparent confusion on the analysis, that really it sounds like then the 100 foot really isn't an option. It's already being done. It's required by law. Well, that needs somewhere probably why that wasn't. We can describe that in our answers.
To be clear, that WUI is more than 100 feet.
Yeah.
Well, it is not, doesn't include the 100.
It doesn't
That's
include
what I
it.
mean.
Yeah.
So,
And the reason why, and we can do that you can provide that in answers to the numerous questions regarding this. Why wasn't that picked as a analysis area? Well, because it's not part of the action, right?
Yeah.
That's a pretty easy answer, but it also I think probably a couple sentences describing why that wasn't picked in the document itself, not just in the answers.
Yeah, so it sounds like we probably need to weave
So
it
two different places.
a little bit into
Very-
chapter
very
3
different
as well.
places in the document.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks.
There's a section of the document that's alternatives considered but not. And we could put something like that in there. One thing, Chairman, at your discretion, and this might be part of the larger discussion we have about utilizing certain science over others, but embedded in several of the 4291 comments, alternative ideas are 4291 plus limiting the WUI to 1,000 feet within homes versus and there's a lot of these, some of these comments are in alternatives analysis, there's other ones that are in program scope and content. And so maybe this is a deferred discussion till then, but I wanted to make sure that part of these comments doesn't get lost, because I think that's something important that we're going to have to address in our response to comments.
in the definition of WUI that we employ,
Right, so
applies the analysis, especially of alternative A unit.
I missed the middle of that, I'm sorry.
So the question is, we can't lose the definition of WUI?
No.
Underlying analysis A?
No, just that some commenters, when they're suggesting as an alternative to analyze or to just utilize PRC 4291, some of them say what you should do is focus on 4291 and allow WUI treatments only in 1,000 feet. So we want, and again, that's something that's reiterated in other comments that we'll get to later. So maybe we can, at your discretion, we can defer this, but I want to make sure that responding to that part of those comments doesn't get lost, because I think we'll need some guidance from the board on what direction to take it.
Well, we probably need some background of where we came up with 1.5 miles, right? And some of the guidance that we have on that.
There's an appendix an expanded appendix that you have now that explains all that. You know, isn't that where it is? There's an appendix, and the appendix is good. A lot of times when the appendix, something that is central to what people are concerned about is in an appendix,
Right.
then they don't see it. And I think that is maybe what happened here. Because even some people like Ann Faggy, who is really a pretty thoughtful person, it's fairly clear she didn't read the appendix. And, because that's where all that information is housed.
So that's how you would answer this first question, the very first one?
Well,
it's not from her, but I mean, it's obviously one of the key for the asking us to focus on.
yeah, why do we pick, basically all the things that ask, why is it 1.5 miles?
Right.
Well, the fact of the matter is, it's not 1.5 miles. It's an algorithm. Well, anyway, you can explain it, but it is not 1.5 miles buffer. I don't know exactly where people got 1.5 miles because it's not. And I think Rachel's going to explain that to us right now. But we could move some of that information a little bit further up in the document, maybe, or maybe not.
So in Chapter 4, from page 431 on to about 440, it goes through exactly how everything was created, why it was created. It's actually a fluctuating buffer based off of what the threat of the infrastructure is, whether it's a structure, whether it's a road, whether it's a communication lines, whether it's power lines. There's many different aspects that go into it, so it moves based off of what type of resource it is. And FRAP did all of that modeling. I wasn't
It's the intersection of layers that would be defined by those different layers.
Exactly. So sometimes it is the full 1.5 miles, sometimes it's a little bit less. It just depends on what is in that area.
And I think people focus on the maximum.
Yes, and the maximum is 1.5 miles, and so everybody just assumes a lot of the time that it's always going to be 1.5 miles, and it goes anywhere, I think, from about 0.5 mile all the way up to 1.5 miles.
Good. The other thing that struck me in reading over the alternative definitions was at times the interpretation of the alternatives as to what their implication might be just felt to me inconsistent, and I'm not sure how detailed our response has to be something like that. There's one comment on the alternatives that implies that, 60,000 acres, 60,000 acres treated every single year, again and again, very destructive. And I couldn't imagine that projects would come back and treat the same acres every single year would ever survive any kind of a project level analysis. And so, how many of those kinds of statements, I don't know quite how to respond to that. I felt like I did once when I was a consultant and someone added the value of the forest up in terms of the trees value in every year of its life. And added this up, which, under your rotation, some of those trees were really valuable trees, given that they had 100 years of their value. But this wasn't worth that. So it's sort of this is not reasonable interpretation of the 60,000. So
I think depending on the comment, and so I think I see one of the ones that you're referring to. Of course, we might have to put it back in the context of their letter, and that might, the whole letter, and that might provide some illumination. But I think that to a certain extent,
the underlying concern is
yeah.
you keep hammering the same place, and the answer is no. That's not what this document's about, or whatever offered us.
I think a comment to that, a response to that effect, is not necessarily disallowed. You're misinterpreting this, and here's how.
Simply say this is a misinterpretation.
Yeah.
The guidelines.
Yeah.
Well, under ecological restoration, that is obviously because of the basis of ecological restoration in the document, you couldn't do that. But it's easy to understand how people could think that,
right?
Because that is how we have treated fuel breaks in Southern California for many years. And those are part of the acres. Yeah. It's the same fuel break every year, and it's treated every year. And I think that's people respond to what's proposed in terms of what they see. Most fuel breaks are treated yearly because they're maintained. Otherwise, they're basically a type conversion, and if you don't continue to treat them, they turn back into brush.
Okay, so
that they might get it from there. And the other reason people might think that is because we require yearly treatment of defensible space. Mm-hmm. And so you can kind of see why people might get that impression just from what they see, not what's written. Mm-hmm. But we could reemphasize, especially for ecological restoration, that is not the case because it's driven by flood regimes.
Right. Okay. Good. That helps me.
I think. That's just my impression of why people could get
that helps me understand the context. That's good. Yeah.
So I wanted to know what other. I actually thought this letter from who are Schuth, Mahaly, and Weinberger. I thought their comments were pretty. Their comments are really long, and these are just segments of them. They spent a lot of time really looking at the document, and did you read those, or should we all? Yeah, I thought they were pretty good. I don't necessarily agree with their comments, but I think we should talk about. They have a lot of comments about how the alternatives are really kind of the same. They're just remixing of and how we would respond to that comment that there wasn't an adequate range of alternatives.
If I may, Chairman, Shute, Mahali, and Weinberger is a law firm contracted by the Endangered Habitats League to comment on the VTP. Endangered Habitats League.
Oh, those, yeah. Well, I think that makes it even more important that we really read their comments carefully and.
They're pretty detailed comments. They're useful, but given the structure of the alternatives, have we not structured, say, alternative A as the location in which you're doing stuff? I think the overwhelming thrust of some of these comments would say if we didn't have a kind of a WUI-focused alternative, that we would have been responsive. And so, a lot of people are saying focus only on certain kind of close-in infrastructure treatment, and others are going farther out. The mix of treatments we have, kind of the toolkit, is the same toolkit regardless of the proximity to infrastructure. And so it feels to me like the range of alternatives with the cap on the total amount that you could do that's determined in part by administrative and financial feasibility or air quality feasibility. Right here, unless we're introducing some tool or taking some tool out of the toolkit, it feels like the concentration of the activities is actually the right scaling of what is the decision space we're operating on. I suppose we could have potentially, if you go through, some of those other alternatives that we decided not to do in that one section, you could define another range, but I think I was comfortable with the reasons that I went through there as to why we did not analyze those alternatives. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be important that everybody knows that they didn't think something like that should have been jumped up. But I do feel like the alternatives we have are pretty good in terms of defining the decision space.
Yeah, I just thought it was a good place to. I think that's part of the area where we're going to get some advice from council.
Yeah, Chairman, I felt too that the alternatives we had were appropriate. I just still, like I said, even today, still trying to struggle to wrap my head around the 100-foot option because it's the smallest. Obviously, it's no option right now. Because it's the closest in space. And usually when you have a range, you like to have it bookend by whatever the absolute smallest is. And probably what you, as I agree with you, whatever the most feasible largest is. So I think given what is the proposed project, which is outside of that 100 foot, I think we got appropriate alternatives. When I kind of worked through that, what we have, and even how they characterized it, I thought it was characterized accurately.
Well, in fact, it would seem like if we were to have a programmatic document that had that focus on what the alternatives were, we would potentially increase the costs of any projects that might be proposed outside of that scope. Perhaps even make them feasible, which strikes me as not necessarily our goal here. Right, if you think about what the existing 20 to 30,000 acres are doing, that kind of focus, if we did, under that situation, you might not want a programmatic EIR if you were to collapse down the guidance and made it more difficult to do some of the stuff that you are doing. Right. Which, in most cases, it would seem, a general characterization would mean that it went through some sort of certification process that was both technical feasibility and community acceptance.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with the range of alternatives to the EIR. They're the closest one to that. It's that 1,000-foot one in terms of getting to some of these comments.
And so the appendix might not be the only place we need to emphasize that. We need to consider Yeah, not just in response, but actually in the documents, so that people don't lose it, right?
Right.
Yeah, appendices are sometimes. I refer people as like too, especially in self-protection. Okay. Other comments on the alternatives analysis? I mean, we do have the impact statement there, so we did have areas we were looking at and so, yet there's a pervasive notion here that there is not enough detail. I was feeling is this kind of a distance between what this document is doing and what you have to do at an actual project level analysis, or were we actually not in a way to come up with summary impacts of the collection project, which might be engaged in system alternative? Is that some of the details that are up to this level? Okay, there are levels where you can't have a local ecological impact based on something which doesn't have an actual project identification, but that doesn't mean this is not an approval of individual projects. Right? So I was a little unclear on the whole issue of the details that's actually required. And in some cases, I wasn't sure that the citations to the case law that are in here necessarily worse than some what the applications of the site case law actually means is the whole analysis. So, anything from the rest of the board on that element of the alternatives analysis? So other than those, the space, the actual range, I think I'm comfortable. I think we're going to have one comment specifically saying why we did not put that 1,000-foot alternative in there, because it's been projected very specific alternative. But I want some things on that.
Well, would we still, is it in the alternatives considered? It is in the alternatives considered, but not analyzed.
Yeah.
Already. I mean, they're really saying, why didn't you pick that one? Not that it's not in there.
Yeah. And I think our answer is actually that the range that's considered is based on a more nuanced approach to what are the features on the landscape which determine space, which is the stuff that it's for.
Right. Well, you know, when possibly we need to beef up, or at least have an explanation of why the program, or the selected alternative, the program, why it was selected over the other ones. It is always hard to explain why you put some alternatives in the category of alternatives considered but not analyzed versus alternatives that are analyzed versus in the NEPA's preferred alternative, but the selected alternative. That's usually one of the places that is most difficult to explain. But the 1,000 feet, in a lot of these comments, it sounds like people didn't actually know that it was considered but not analyzed. And I think that's the answer to Edith, to a lot of those comments.
Yeah, I'll look for that.
We did think about this, and it's on page whatever.
Right. And there's actually
And there's a
analysis
reason
of a more
of
nuanced
why.
alternative
Yeah.
based on different
Yeah.
distances. Some of the comments on alternative analysis, like in particular the one 92, why would programs carried out in our incredibly rich state have to be consistent? And it was unlawful inconsistent. The consistent application of SPRs. It felt to me like this is confusing the objective of SPRs quite a bit with what it means in terms of practice on the ground. That, in fact, I felt they were really an attempt to get at local nuanced approaches, not an attempt to enforce conformity of what vegetation treatment programs look like on the ground. So I felt in this case it's a significant comment, but I think it's actually turning the process a bit on its head. I don't know how you guys reacted to that. I think we're talking about a consistent process in which things would be analyzed, but not necessarily consistency in the actual the criteria that would come to the fore in analyzing any specific project, or that they would all look like cookie cutters. I think the approach is the antithesis of that. So, am I misreading that one? It just feels like it's got it backwards. So that was a fairly easy one to respond to. The way we're all reading it. Okay.
Just to show it on the right.
92, so like you're saying.
On page 47.
Consistent applications. Why should
I was actually, I still couldn't understand what they were trying to do today. I had the difference between SPRs and mitigation measures, that whole, I mean, there's numerous letters, and I'm trying to understand where they got off track on that.
Yeah.
And I was hoping I'd get some clarity today. I haven't, even your explanation didn't provide me the clarity I was looking for.
Well, it's broken this game for me.
No, I'm still thinking about it. And maybe there's some nuances in the sequel world that I'm just not.
But I mean, you could argue the same thing. It's like, you could say, well, why do we need a sequel? Yeah. Right? Well, you do want a consistent framework.
Right.
And this is about a framework for looking at, not that it's trying to force everything into the same solution. It's actually kind of highlighting that you have to consider things, but it's to get a locally appropriate solution. So, yeah. We had a couple questions about why we rejected things. And I thought the comment also by St. Clair 96, where judgments assume vegetation treatments the overarching goal and method. And I think it's easy to respond that it is not the overarching goal, but it is a programmatic EIR for vegetation treatment. And so, yes, it is the overarching method, but the goal is clearly stated as not simply to do vegetation treatment, but just one tool.
Yeah, I think a lot of your earlier comments about this being one tool and this different agencies have different,
Right.
well, everything that you said earlier, I think adequately responds.
Some of them with our purview, building codes and stuff, which I think is great. I had to point one paper out that I felt in my entire career I did some good on. It would be the thing Ethan did on the Painted Cave Fire about roofs. And what was their impact on sectors like? Blindingly clear, simple results. Okay. So any other questions? Otherwise, we've kind of been through the alternatives analysis section. Were there any of the other comments, Ms. Hannigan, that you felt you were expecting us to take a look at it?
No, I think under alternatives analysis, I think they're pretty well covered. I have a couple places that we'll get some guidance from counsel on about his opinion on the adequacy of the document. I have a couple specific questions for counsel about. I think under CEQA, if people propose an alternative, you have to analyze it, and so I need to work with him to figure out exactly what that part of CEQA says, because that could impact us, how we change the document and stuff. But I think we've covered a lot of the yeah.
Great. Any place that people like to go next? We've got a really big need here. Continuing on call category or back
One I had, and I guess there is one individual from the Department of Fish and Wildlife here. And we've gotten quite a bit of testimony on it. It's the very last one on the summary page.
Vegetation classification.
The vegetation classification. I was kind of surprised in the Department of Fish and Wildlife's letter it was in there. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, because I thought we had quite a bit of robust discussion about this, that this is the vegetation classification, which is what the Department of Fish and Wildlife is using, is what they're going to be using going forward, and as the trustee agency, that's what they're going to encourage agencies and other departments like CAL FIRE to use in the future. But I thought it was pretty clear what we heard from Bill Condon was that really, while there are portions of the state that vegetation classification system is there and they're working on individual projects, it's really not ready for prime time on a scope and scale that we're dealing with here across the whole state.
Right.
So
I heard that.
Yeah, that was pretty clear. We heard it several times.
And I felt comfortable about migrating there in the future or amending.
I thought it was a statement about the board's activities as a whole may need to migrate to the vegetation.
Right, but their comment was kind of like they'd like to see it now. All of a sudden, I'm wondering if this was just a difference between what Bill was telling us versus this particular manager at Department of Fish and Wildlife. But I think I'm comfortable with us migrating as that gets developed and it can be used on a statewide basis. Great, it can't be used now.
I think
that was pretty clear.
The analysis of these alternatives is based on the systems we've got.
Right.
It may well be over the life of this that project level analysis employs the alternative vegetation systems where that's appropriate or project level analysis.
Right.
I
agree. I think
this is an easy reasonable path.
I was just kind of surprised they came out with that statement again.
I think just they probably for the CEQA record, it's in there, and then we would respond, with exactly what you just described. That would be my guess, but I'm not.
Okay.
But I appreciated the constructive way in which they brought that in.
Good.
Much as I appreciate the constructive way that we said we were having some trouble running CalVeg.
Member Farber?
The endangered species.
What page? What comment
So
number?
it was just linked to CalVeg.
I don't have the.
Of course, and they fixed it.
I don't have the exact number.
Okay.
No.
I know what you're talking about. Though.
It's coming. Yeah, I don't know where it is in your. It's the Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
don't do
Oh, yeah,
it.
I know.
It
Yeah.
would be,
Agency.
it would be an agency comment, sorry, Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah.
And we did have that extensive discussion of that at our last workshop with Mr.
Chairman, there was one comment I was curious about, and that was brought up by a couple, including a state agency, the water board, on the accelerants for dry fire. And I was curious if we had a response on that one.
I think those are under. Are those under programs? Oh no, environmental impacts. I think most of those are under.
I wrote down the number.
This might take a minute.
We may have Department of Fish and Wildlife might not want to add a comment to our last list.
Right.
We're just, you don't have to.
Hi, this is Elliot Chase. I'm with Department of Fish and Wildlife. Without going back, and it's been a couple months now, without going back and looking at the specifics of the comment, I don't think I can give you a great answer here, and we can provide something else in writing if you're looking for a little more clarity. I think generally speaking, we would have preferred to see something with a little bit more level of granularity than shrubs, trees, and grasses. And I think that would have lended to a more complete analysis of resources. So be it using the NVCS or another classification system, I think those would have improved the analysis.
Right, although as Member Farber was pointing out in the budget, our impression was NVCS is local. It's not complete coverage yet, so.
Well, so I'm not an expert on that. I know it's not 100% mapped in the state, but there have been crosswalks, and there have been other methods for utilizing the system for going forward. So those could have been alternatives to using a more simplified system. There could have been something done, and I think that's where we were going, if I recall correctly, with our comment.
In our recollection, Chairman, is that there's some language in the VTP EIR, I'm looking at the team, that describes that eventuality may occur. I thought that's what was in there, but
I don't think that's in there, but I think that it's something that's maybe worth adding.
See whether that's in the comments or
Yeah.
they have to add it.
Yeah, I can check.
Yeah, and again, this is competing.
as it's available,
information.
the
I mean,
key thing
that-
is when it's available.
Yeah, but
I thought we had some language that we talked about.
but the breakdown, of course, that we had in the systems was advice from the Fire Science Consortium. So we are getting, we're responding to a variety of different.
Of course, yeah. So we as the state's trustee agency for biological resources would like to see a classification scheme used with a high level of detail, and that's going to be the comment that we're going to make. So, and I think if I remember correctly, our comment is sort of in line with that philosophy. So, thank you.
Well, the other, just to again, is that CNPS, the new vegetation, the CalVeg system, it's not new. It just hasn't been used. It's been used by other agencies for a long time, and I think that was part of the disconnect, at least the one that I had, because it is at this scale available. But the main thing I think in the future, as this is that it's much easier to crosswalk that system to condition class than it is to crosswalk CWHR condition class. And, there's not an easy crosswalk for it. But FRAP has done as good a job as they possibly could doing that, and so that's available now. And I think, isn't FRAP in the latest statewide analysis switching over, Rachel?
They merged them, so they merged the two systems together to create one master ventilator that we updated in this document when it came out in December.
Oh, yeah. So
we did the update when that came out in December to reflect the latest and greatest information from FRAP.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's escaping me which member brought this up, but accelerants, those comments from the Water Quality Control Boards, start on page 86. There's 3 of them, if that was of interest to the board. maybe it's not.
So the comment is really whether or not we adequately drew on the Forest Service literature with regard to environmental impacts of the accelerants, particularly near water courses, which would be put in a thumbnail.
Yeah, I think that this can be pretty easily worked into both the hazardous materials section and the water quality section. Make sure we crosswalk those two sections together. I think with our riparian zone restrictions, and we're not lighting within those zones, that provides some additional added protection. We can explain the rationale for SPRs to try to mitigate those impacts, as well as referencing the citation that they suggest here. So
Right.
it should
So
be
in some cases, it's really just highlighting our guidelines for
yeah.
the use of these. But
Yeah.
So it's a silent issue.
I mean, one of our big mitigations is not to light within riparian zones. So that I would assume, without reading the pertinent literature, if you give enough buffering distance, it's usually the potential for impact is going to be less. But we'll need to look at the citation here to make sure it's consistent with that mitigation.
Yeah.
One thing, too, that they kind of left out of the comments was that those are, almost exclusively used in aerial ignition. So this doesn't really, the comments don't, maybe the people that commented assume that we knew that. I mean, they say that ping pong balls, potassium permanganate is better, but those don't really work. The difference is that in brush where there's no flashy fuels underneath, they don't work very well because they fall on the ground and go out. But I think I don't know if we differentiated very much in the. I can't remember whether. I don't think the document talks very much about whether the prescribed burning is going to be through aerial ignition but most of the proposed projects are pretty small, and you wouldn't necessarily use aerial ignition.
Yeah.
And in the WUI, it's not as common a practice. I think if we're going to need to differentiate where the accelerants are used, in general, you're using, diesel and gas,
Torches.
and not necessarily these products unless it's a specialized ignition. So probably it's going to take because I thought about that and I forgot to mention it when I was reading the methods section. It was kind of silent on ignition type.
So
Yeah, Rachel just informed me that we don't allow for
Yeah.
aerial ignition for the VTP. So
Really?
Yeah. I'm pretty. I'm pretty sure that's explicitly stated somewhere in the document, but clearly not well enough.
Why is that? You would be doing a separate environmental document if it was an aerial ignition? And
I think it probably just the scope of a project that would utilize something like that was not something that we wanted as part of the VTP. But I could be wrong on that. And also, well, I don't know what that means. And it would have required a lot more.
Check that.
It would have.
It's means accelerant. If this issue is about aerial ignition.
It is about aerial
we're not
ignition.
doing aerial ignition.
Yeah. Well, that makes it a pretty easy.
way to
Yeah.
deal
Yeah.
with.
The Forest Service analysis, which was driven by wildfire.
Right. It's
for burnout and backfire, although there is some use of aerial ignition for prescribed burns, in the Forest Service, but I think that's where it was. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that would be one of the
You might want to
easiest
check the
things to do,
papers.
so let's
Yeah.
double check. And in fact, just double check to make sure we have no aerial ignitions going on. Whatever current practices as well. Good.
But we should check VTP EIR page 452, because they're saying that we did say that we would use it. A94, that comment, Glenn Robertson.
Can I say that, Susan?
You may.
So a quick correction to our statement. It was actually the no aerial spraying of herbicides that we were referencing. My apologies.
Yeah,
I knew there was no aerial
I know, right?
Anyway.
So that sounds like it's probably not going to be a difficult response, but let's give the agency their action about their utilization of practice. I think actually it may just be something as simple as this.
Well, I think it is done by CAL FIRE.
If not, then it may be
CAL FIRE
as
has
Mr.
helicopters.
Yeah, but it could be, as Mr. Coe points out,
Yeah.
that
It'll be
if
burned
the
up
issues
away.
when we reference the literature that look at the self-haunted sensitivity level, you could use in fact that are operating around water courses is adequate to deal with this in terms of what's actually permitted. It could be just an omission in the document that maybe sending a comment would then be very helpful in getting that on the record. So that's good. Okay. I don't think authority for the program is necessarily one that we have to spend a lot of time with, which I think that's actually the council. I think we do have the authority to do with this. We've been going on for 10 years. How many comments did we get on authority for the program?
A small to moderate amount, I'd say. Enough for a category, not so many that it's really.
What page were those on?
I could flip. Let's see. I imagine they might be up near program when we were looking at program effectiveness. I should have written a note to myself about the order I put these comments in.
There's also interest in public involvement.
Oh, lots, yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking we might pick one
really help, you know that comment categorization?
Yes.
If next to each of them we could have the page number of where they start.
Sure.
I'll just add it to this.
Yeah, just add it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's what I was saying. I should have made a list for myself of the order I put them in this.
Once you do,
Yeah.
let us have it too.
Oh yeah. Of course.
Now I'm going to write it down.
I was going to say what page?
Actually, start on 74.
I was just about to get there. Oh yeah, here we go. Authority. I rephrased. Authority for the program. Yes, there's maybe like 4 or 5 comments. Some of which are more substantive than others.
Okay, so the first comment, 59, says that we have not explained the necessity of the program. I actually think we have a section on this, and we discussed this, so there is an explanation of the necessity. So that's not what you're saying. I think clearly, there's feelings about the adequacy of the state of necessity. So what is the PRC code reference? And the idea that PRC 4741 says the board will assist by making this but not conducted, and that seems consistent with what we do.
I think also this references a citation in the executive summary, and I believe there's more specific. There is much more specific information about the statutory authority for this program in Chapter 1 and in the actual body of the document.
Yeah. So actually, I'm having difficulty responding to comments 59 and 60 because I think the nature of this programmatic local projects seems to me to be consistent with the language that's cited here. So
Oh, yeah,
I think
even
that's
so.
probably a pretty easy response.
Mm-hmm.
I'll try to be as voluntary and unauthorized by all. Follow. I suppose we do need to be clear on our authority to be engaged in the oversight, which comes back to the charge to the board, which is already cited in the PRC. Will not be following. I think that's a response to the comment, not something I don't think we have to include a statement in the EIR would indicate we believe people will actually follow the program.
But this is an opportunity if we came up with a statement about the claim on is voluntary, we agree.
Yeah.
In the whole statement, in the line of logic we were going down with,
Yeah.
members sorry about that's an opportunity to restate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So in other words, if you wanted to do it your own CEQA process, you could do it outside of this.
Yeah.
Good luck.
There you go.
We'll probably leave that out of the response.
The next 2 comments, if that's where you're looking next, Chairman, they're somewhat related, and there's a comment earlier from this gentleman that's in a different section of this document, but what he's connecting this federal program for this watershed to the VTP, and if you look at his second comment in the gray here, there's obviously some confusion about who has the authority over.
Interior on tribal lands. Yeah, I think that's probably dealt with in a response to the comment rather than changing the document. So that one's pretty straightforward. Well, good. So that's through there. Do we want to? So like easier than I thought to authority for the program. So do we want to jump to the public involvement? Is that where people like to go? I mean, it's clearly something that we can conversation about. Okay.
Let's see, is it time to find it?
139.
Thank you, Trevor.
So the first comment is about the method of notification of the public. And boy, my memory is failing me on this. Some project team about what the project notification language we use was.
I am going to defer to members of the team if I'm wrong, please correct me. But the only notification that CEQA requires is this newspaper publication, and
right. And so this is the notification there. Okay, I got it.
And so because this program, it's a statewide program that we're proposing, but we don't have immediately the infrastructure for it,
Right.
And so we didn't want to commit the department in the proposed program to doing some type of notification process or setting up a website, we didn't want to commit the department to doing something like that without exploring the department's ability to do that. But part of the charge to the department in implementing this program is to figure out something.
So I think
but Gabe is coming up to correct me, so
the opening
I
of that
probably.
statement from Stephen, public notification opportunity for involvement needs to be realistic and robust, and I think it's absolutely so.
Gabe Schultz with Cal Fire. Yeah, that's effectively what it is. So when it comes to the CEQA notification process we're going through right now would meet the actual CEQA aspect. What was put in here, just on the project scale, we have the notification for the newspaper part, and we have the public workshop element that's tied to these projects. Mm-hmm. That was on an intent to try to keep this focused just on a local level. One of the things that we were concerned about was that we're looking at community projects to help benefit the community there. That's really designed, it starts with them. It looks at the local Cal Fire unit to identify that this is truly a strategic part to put a fuel treatment. So once it goes through all of that internal local, we really wanted to keep it as local inputs. You know, if there's something that's wrong just with the project, we really want the local interest just to show there. So that's why the newspaper is there, and that there are just a couple comments that explore that in terms of looking at some sort of internet-based posting, similar to how our THP system is. But originally the design was really let's try to keep this local to make sure that we're designing the best product or the best project in this case for that community's needs.
And so the stating here they need to maintain an online list of current complete projects, draft projects. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that sort of mandated in our kind of ultimate objectives for things like CalMapper? I mean, isn't that something that we might want to state by reference to the other programs of the state, which are broader than this in terms of the information portal that CAL FIRE provides or other agencies for members of the public?
Correct, and that's one of the other benefits about this whole programmatic EIR is that one, we're putting it into just a centralized database. Just in case for Cal Fire's purposes, all the projects just are going into CalMapper. It's sort of what we're looking at, and one of the challenges that we're seeing just through the Tree Disk Mortality Task Force efforts too, just of identifying projects across the landscape. Having a collective area where we can identify the totality of the projects that's being implemented across the ground is something that we don't have a easy button for. So we don't so right now we do not put all of our fuel projects just of various types into a singular database. So Mapper is that database for us, and it allows us to help not only just collect the information, but turn it around and just look at or evaluate what's going on and the types of projects. Ultimately, what we're looking at here through this program is a better understanding of the impacts and the effects just of our fuel treatments. This will allow us to start identifying where fuel breaks have been built. We can keep them in a database so we can look at them later. So as they are challenged with fire, we can identify what worked, what didn't work a lot easier than currently when we have funding this year for a fuel break, but 5-10 years later, that fuel break might be forgotten. So this is just one of those tools. But that centralized database set, that's a benefit for us.
I think that's something for the team to look at here. In the sense, I feel like the response to this is actually a very strong one, but it's an evolutionary one, just like the comment on we should be mapping areas of high mortality. It's like, well, there are things in place. They're not necessarily the parts of this document, but so I think we would need to see whether that's a response and a comment or whether we need to reference the fact that there are ongoing activities to build a database like this, which would be accessible to public through a repository. So I think probably a balance of the two. Let's just see, correct the document and see how it should.
And just to add to that, part of just the monitoring efforts, that's also part of the appendix section just of this programmatic EIR, just illustrates that as funding just becomes available, just the continuing research capability just of utilizing this information just to identify what works and what doesn't is one of the outcomes that we are looking for.
Is CalMapper publicly available?
No, it is not.
Which is the issue, which is why I say it's an evolutionary response.
Yeah.
Right. I just want to make sure we highlight that.
Yeah.
It's okay. So, because I know in some groups where Cal Fire is active in like fire safe councils, I thought they've been providing maps of the outputs of CalMapper.
Providing maps and providing products from it, yes. The database itself is just
online.
Correct.
Yeah. So we maybe to soften that response, we can kind of describe how it's being used. So again, it's that theme of the local community. Mm-hmm. The fire safe, because I've seen that in the Reading area. I mean, they've tried to use that already.
But I guess when on the water board, if you're signed up for a watershed, you're going to get pinged every time there's a project in that watershed.
Uh-huh.
So
right.
I think that's kind of what the comment is sort of driving.
It's clearly the intent of the comment. Yeah.
Well, right now, isn't the focus now to put projects in after they're completed?
We're actually looking just for multiple inputs. So
but it isn't planned projects quite yet, right?
We're actually doing that element as well. However, CalMapper is a work in progress. So it's got things that are being worked on just to try to tweak it, just to make it better. So every year that program just continues to get better. But to answer your question, I mean, there's good data and there's bad data and there's data that's got to get cleaned up because the system captures so much. There's a lot of areas that are getting cleaned up. Starting on a programmatic approach like this, where we're putting data in that's fresh, putting data in that can be organized right out of the gate, allows us just to utilize this type just of inputs much more successfully. So in a shorter amount of time, we will be able to create better data as opposed to having so many projects getting put in where there's a cleanup just approach to it.
Yeah, I think, but what a lot of these comments are about are making the data available to the public. And right now it's kind of an internal thing. So I kind of think we should be careful not to talk about CalMapper. We can certainly talk about CalMapper, that there's better data and we're striving to get everybody to put their projects in, and sometimes they're in before and sometimes they put them in afterwards. The fuel breaks frequently don't get in, all that kind of stuff. But, I think what these people are asking for is something that they could look at. And so we need to be careful about how we answer that if that's not going to be available to the public for a while. They do reference the Forest Service database, which is, if you go to any forest website, there's a link to planning, and then all the projects are tracked, through all their stages, and this is in NEPA on that database, and I think that CalMapper is a long way from meeting that expectation. We just shouldn't probably overpromise on that. But I have another question about all of these public involvement comments. A lot of them have to do with California Native Plant Society, and my recollection is we did not, some of the they're saying they like Bio 5, but they want to see more stuff. And there's a lot in here about including approval by CNPS. I think right now it's CDFW, right?
Correct.
And I don't see that we could have projects, there's 2 or 3 comments that had to be approved by by California Native Plant Society, which is non-governmental, and I'm not really sure that we would do that. But we would go, hopefully CDFW would be talking to CNPS.
Correct.
I mean, mostly because CNPS, is really less active in a lot of areas of the state. It's just a few people, and and besides, it has a different objective everywhere, in the state. But I think we need to be careful not to do what's suggested. Some of it's good, but I don't think we want to turn it over to California Native Plant Society quite yet. I don't know what California Department of Fish and Wildlife Service thinks about that.
I think, and this is one where legal counsel would be great, but California Native Plant Society is one of the great organizations
Yeah,
in the state.
I'm a member, but
it's not a monolithic voice. It has, like most environmental NGOs, there's sometimes a higher level voice and a lower level voice. They're not always in concert. So when you privilege one NGO, especially if it has multiple identities, get some problems. And I think they would not be the only voice like this, and so this gets into the whole relationship issues as to many stakeholders or a privileged stakeholder. And so yes, I think while I would value their input, because these are an organization of people that have a passion for the subject, with great land, great expertise to bring to bear, and great local expertise to bring to bear, and they're forceful advocates for the environment in all kinds of local needs. It's not something where a mandated consultation or approval process that would empower one NGO actually is something that I would ever be able to vote for as part of the procedures for the board. Great respect for the organization, but encourage them to stay really active. But I'm not sure that we can go there even without I don't think we necessarily have a FACA-like restriction that Sue would have had long experience with on some of these things. But it's just I don't see any one organization as having more power seat at the table, even though there's some of them that have more to provide the discourse than others. Are we sort of support consistent with that for organizations? I mean, there's other parts that are right down there. We have consultations with people like Fish and Wildlife, which are part of our not only logical collaborations, but actually, we frequently share responsibility on some of this between the agencies and their
Like CDFW, I thought they already do your policy or code rely upon CNPS for their listed species, list 1A, 1B, and CNPS kind of.
They do, but we consult with CDFW.
Right.
Consultation is really specific, and if we have that anywhere, and I can't remember, but hopefully, we can make sure that we only consult with specific agencies.
Well, I know we have specific consultations that are in here. I know we have specific
Right, but I
consultations
hope
on tribal issues.
I hope it doesn't include consultation with CNPS in the document. Did they just add that to Bio 5? See where Celia Kusher, it's, anyway, if you look down through it, not take place in old growth chaparral without consultation regarding the potential of significant impacts with CDFW, and then it says and the CNPS, and I don't know if that's in the document or whether it was just added by the commenter.
That's a good question. I believe, based on the way she's formatted the rest of her comments, that's it's in the document like that. Yeah, and then her editorial starts in the brackets.
Yeah, I would just like to know from council, do we have an agreement, or does CDFW have an agreement that we could actually consult with CNPS? It would be unique in my experience. Consultation is that has a very specific legal term.
Right.
So if we did word it this way, we should talk to council about whether, it's probably, I'd be surprised.
I'd be surprised too. So,
I would be too.
okay. Yes.
Question just on the public involvement now, as a refresher. When they talk about public notification and the opportunity for involvement, it seemed like I recall that there was going to be this workshop idea, not a public process for CEQA, but it was a workshop, informative workshop to gather community input. But that was outside of the WUI. That was for projects that were outside of the WUI, ecological restoration project. That's correct.
Yeah, there were workshops just for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is the public notification, that's just to say we have this project. At what stage is the public notification occurring? Now that the project has been reviewed by the coordinator and approved, or somewhere earlier that there's really no opportunity for public involvement? So what's the purpose of the notification, or how does that work?
I think Gabe knows the specifics of that.
This was actually brought up during one of our earlier workshops on this issue, and one of the things that we did was we changed the project implementation process, just the VTP chart. You guys just recall that. So there is a new box, and so basically after the consultation has already been done just with the other agencies, and that we have a product to discuss what's happening just on the ground, then there's supposed to be that public outreach locally before they finish that checklist, though. So the purpose was that not everything was supposed to be done, and then we show the public. The public were supposed to, if they're interested, to be part of that decision process.
Is that just in the ecological restoration outside of the WUI?
That's for projects outside of that WUI, and the logic with that was that the WUI projects were considered as a high priority element that already had the local support, and it was the purpose there being just on private properties that were working just in individuals' backyards at that point. As you go further within the landscape to where a fuel break might be on less individuals' properties, but be identified to help just a larger community as a whole, then there might be just some other inputs that could be of value there.
Great, thanks for
But it is interesting. I think we will need to look and make sure. I mean, obviously, the newspaper, it's in there. That's an artifact of the period in which that part of Coco is written, right? But we're the statement that they gave, it's got to be realistic and robust. That's actually a good aspiration. So we have to think: are we meeting that? Are we reaching out? And I know, my reaction to saying, well, one should be prioritized. I understand the stakeholder there, but if I remember correctly from Rachel Smith's dissertation, when she was going through all of the unit level community wildfire protection plans, she did a survey of everybody that was an identified stakeholder in the process of consultation and developing those plans, which obviously have a relationship with these projects. And I think that list of stakeholders was over 600 for the state. So there is an identified stakeholder community which is broader, which has an interest in a lot of these dimensions. So although I understand the particular expertise of the United Society on some of these issues that goes up, but we need to make sure that whatever this consultation is, or not consultation, whatever the notification is to actually give people a participation opportunity, that it has to respect that real, incredibly diverse group. It's watershed councils and all kinds of people, just at an organizational level, and then it's individuals with stated interest as well. So, and not that, and newspapers is sort of the old school, but it is what's in the code, right? So, any other comments on that before we move on? I mean, 69 has some good stuff in it, but that's about the workshop.
I do, my impression, and board members, if you feel otherwise, you of course bring it up, but my impression was a lot of the public involvement comments hit a lot of the same themes and can be answered by a lot of the same one response or a couple responses. So
the way to have input, and although I think we were trying to promote something where the input, in addition to the input we're going through right now, was how do you affect the project level? And make sure that's there, but there's also the data transparency and the rest of the
I was just going to, Susan's comment that we don't want to promise too much, but it seems like we have not promised enough if we're not transparent on this data. So I don't know, maybe we need to push back on the department and say we need to develop these systems before we can submit the DIR. We can't do this. There's this one comment where they searched for the EMPs online and came up with nothing. That's kind of haunting. If you can't even show that we've done anything in the past with any kind of coherence in our previous efforts, I don't know if we can justify saying that we can say with confidence that we'll have a good public process if we can't even put in some places where we're going to ensure something. I don't know. It just seems.
Well, we have the option of pushing back on the department to expedite the development of a CalMap mapper type product that would be available to the public with planned projects input. The thing about what would be much easier than relying on CalMap mapper, of course, is to just have a table of projects by unit that were proposed online on the website. I think that's doable. I think spatially explicit planned projects through CalMapper is going to be a lot harder to do and take a lot longer. That's why it's not available, because it has so much data, and so I guess if that were possible for the department to just have a table to promise a table and have it distributed publicly, I think that that's something, that's what SOPA is, the Forest Service product. It's not, it has been linked to mapping more recently, but in the past it was just it's a tabular tracking, a project tracking, and it came about because of lawsuits.
If I may, part of the requirements just of a project to be disapproved just through this process is that it's also part of the unit fire plan. And so the unit fire plans already do have that stuff illustrated. They already have it listed. So if someone's looking just for a project, the origin to look for an approved project is within that unit fire plan, which is posted.
And do we state, and this is the problem of my trying to keep a document this linked in my head, do we state that?
We do state that
in the proposed VTP?
We do state that it does need to be part just of that unit fire plan. It's one of the things that we lean on just for the validity just of that fuel treatment project. And so it's probably something that we could probably push, make a little bit more clear.
Let's make sure that, there is a certain standard of information that I think all projects that go forward now in terms of the information that's out there. And so at the very least, documenting current practice and where things are in a unit plan or where we say, So to some level, say what we're doing might be more than what's in the plan, but I would really think this would be a great thing to go back, given the concerns over transparency and access to data, to make sure we're not under-promising or over-promising. At the very least, we would need to say, because now that you bring that up, I do remember the statement that part of this is that projects would be part of the unit fire plan.
Correct.
But I'm not sure that appears in the document in place that is directly responsive to public engagement. It feels to me that is in a different place in the document. And so if nothing else, this is an organizational problem where the same information might well need to be in two places for people to understand what the process of public involvement would be. So let's go back and look at that.
Okay.
But you're right, we're not going to say eventually we will have a business system that looks like this. I've had at the university too many promises of business systems that will roll out and solve all the problems that in fact simply create.
So I guess I have a question. So Gabe, are those unit fire plans updated annually?
Yes.
Or
and the projects that are part of them, they can be updated frequently. So they're updated annually, posted on that schedule, but the actual plans themselves can be updated just on a daily basis.
Are they available online?
The online one is that yearly update. Then they can go to the local unit just to find out if there's any changes
so
in between time.
So the website posts that, and so you've got comments here saying they could post things on that websites. And so at the very least, we would want to say these projects are part of unit fire plans, which are updated on the schedule, and they are posted on the website.
Right.
That would simply be a statement of fact, which might well address some of these issues of transparency. So let's go back and look at the detail we have in there, as to whether we're even stating what is.
So are BMPs currently in the unit plans?
BMPs can be if they're known about. That is part just of the unit fire plan strategy. Yeah.
Well, that'd be good to know too.
Yeah, and so let's make sure that information is in every place where it ought to be in the document. Some redundancy here is not a bad thing.
Okay. And just to clarify, it is in chapters 1, 2, and in the monitoring just appendix.
But is it in the section specifically where we talked about community involvement?
No, that was not a consideration of what the relationship was there at the time. So yeah,
so
we can add that.
So very reasonable comment in the public if someone went to delve into the document looking for the public involvement section.
Yeah, that's an easy change.
So that's the post project. there's still a problem with the pre-project engagement.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking on the CAL FIRE website. This is the scary thing about me having and there's a link to all the fire plans, and they are all 2015.
So you're implying they're not updated because they're last year?
No, I'm just saying there's a link and they're 2015. So, and they're the most current fire plans. Let's see. Anyway, yeah, they're on here.
October is the release date for.
The release date. So there'll be one in 2016.
Yeah.
October 2016. Okay. Yeah, I think, people look for things, and, it is hard to find this sort of stuff if you don't know where to look. So I think the more specific we can be, the better.
So I think that's something, Dave, to look at, and that's something when I reread, I'll look at a particular concern too, because we really have an obligation here to make sure that that process is right.
If I may add something too real quick, not that it's related and I don't want to undersell or oversell, but FRAP is experimenting with a project mapper is what it's called for the tree mortality task force, and it's a way that allows the public to put in projects. It's a completely scaled down GIS world, so that anyone can enter something in. And so far it looks like that it is a successful application. It's going to continue to get tested just as additional projects are put into it. But it is one of those deals that we are continuously exploring what kind of interface that we can have.
That's right. And whether we're exploring or whether it is what is, to me sometimes is what belongs in a response to a comment versus what belongs in the programmatic EIR itself. That saying something is fine because we'll end up solving this problem eventually is different than saying in response to a comment, what is the current system, here are the developments which are going on in the state, which we hope will actually result in an improved situation over the process to enable public involvement that's documented in the document that's being circulated, right? I hate aspirational statements like that. Will things or something in a document. But I think they're very important for the public response to where we're going. Just clean stuff.
So, Keith,
Yeah.
one more thing on public involvement, and then that'll be it for me. We do need a response, and I'm sure Edith can do this, where there's two parts of public involvement in these comments. One, how are they going to get involved in the project review and all that kind of stuff. But there's also a whole bunch of comments about, how the public there was no way of knowing about this PEIR. There's quite a few of those.
Yeah.
And so I think Edith has the list of all the different ways that you guys got the information out to the public, and we'll just need a paragraph about here are the because there were a lot of efforts to get the information out and available to people.
Okay, so if I was the chairman, if I remember right, I heard, so I think I'm clear on the projects that are from the WE out. Mm-hmm. There's a public posting in the newspaper, and there's a collaboration of a group. Mm-hmm. So that's where there's public involvement. So what's going on from that WUI line in? I think that's what Member Los Huertos is getting at. The involvement is post-project. It's in the unit fire plan. But
the unit fire plan actually has a public engagement process associated with this development. So, which is why I know there's a stakeholder list for each.
So what's going on in that little?
Well, I think
between
well, I'm going to
100 feet and 1.5 miles.
Again, I guess it's important to start out with saying that CAL FIRE may not be the creator of every single project. It's going to come from the public interest. I mean, if the public wants a project to surround them, the initial discussions that we had is that they're going to be contacting just the local fire station and starting there just with that contact with that unit. So when we're talking about a WUI project just being just supported in this case, it's really developed from that community that wants it. Now, Cal Fire may engage just a area that may be just of higher risk, just to help just identify interest. But ultimately, it's going to be just the collaboration from the unit with that community that wants that fuel break or that WUI treatment done. Again, it's got to be part of that unit fire plan, and the purpose just of that is, again, that strategy part. Is it logical? Does it make sense? Can the unit end up just supporting what the end treatment's going to end up being? So the involvement from that stage, it doesn't have that public workshop aspect to it, but it is one that's hand in hand with those homeowners, basically. So it's one that, because you're operating 100 feet outside of everyone's backyard, that you're really working with them much more intimately than you might be just on a field break, which could be on a few individuals' properties just versus 50 homes. So that's kind of the relationship and difference there. You don't sound convinced, or you don't look it.
I can still see where there's going to be some concern in different communities where there's absolutely no public notification until a year and a half down the road when it's in the unit fire plan. And it's long, the project's long said and done. That's what I'm under. Maybe I'm misunderstanding how it gets in the unit fire plan. But that's what's happening here.
So the question, I think, is whether the unit fire plan is actually a plan of actions to move forward on, or a record of actions.
It's both, just in that context. So it is a plan. It is a record. One of the things it identifies a number just of various projects. The prioritization of what those projects are on when they may get done can have various variables that identify that, probably dominantly funding. But in terms of that aspect, the unit fire plan does have its own public process just tied to it. So there is a evaluation, but that's the same for all three levels, whether it's the eco restoration or fuel break beyond that WUI. But in terms of that, again, it comes down to the question of the public notification aspect. In this case here, it's really the public that you're impacting the most, or the people that you're trying to do that WUI treatment just around. The public workshop, also, just to keep in mind, again, is not a necessary element. We threw that one in just to try to, provide that additional public avenue to identify any consequences that are being overseen or underseen. But again, the public workshop is not a CEQA mechanism in this situation. It was simply offered to help us bridge that relationship with the public.
But I think there's one of your word choices there says what we're moving around here. You just used the word notification, and there is a notification requirement in CEQA, and it's here, we've referenced it. But the categorization that Ms. Hannigan has used for these comments is involvement, which is the aspiration for communities to be involved in the programs.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm saying is I just know a bit about the community wildfire, or the unit plans and community wildfire protection plans and how those are prepared. And they are both forward-looking and historically documenting actions. And so part of documenting what is just making sure that the way in which we engage the public at a project level is documented here, even if it's not a separate process if it's a reference to, if you put in would be documented unit plan, that has a public involvement process that calls upon by virtue of being there. I'm not sure that we have actually, from the tenor of these comments, documented fully that statement that it would be in a unit plan actually comes with opportunities for involvement which are above and beyond what you might say. That's like it's going backwards into existing operations, not setting up something separate, because you're embedding these projects in the operating environment of the agency. So I'm suspecting that just building off of what the meaning is of they would be things that are identified as the unit plan would actually be quite reassuring to the public in terms of, is there actually a mechanism for public involvement in the process by which actual projects move forward under the umbrella of this Vtpeir, right? Which is a separate issue than the public engagement about the Vtpeir, which is a completely different thing. So let's just make sure that my feeling there's enough comments here that we probably haven't communicated that right yet, and probably some enhancement of the language in the document, although not a lot necessarily, not just something to deal with in a comment. That
Correct.
You've already created a sense of an obligation, not of notification above and beyond secret, but by saying something has to be a project. That does mean something about the public's opportunity for
Alternatively, I would add, you may have, you may have communicated it quite well, and the public didn't like what they read.
Possible too.
Because I think,
let's look at it with both eyes.
and that's what we did. This is coming back, we discussed this previously, the balancing of the tiering and streamlining Vtpeir.
Yes.
And so the whole point was we're doing the analysis up front, and then when a landowner wants to go in or a group of landowners want to go in and do it, it wasn't supposed to be this whole, everybody gets another bite at the apple we talked about. So we talked about that. And
good point. Okay. It is the hour at which I went past the college rule that we can do business. That's fine, without compelling logic, because some people have to pay child care. After hours.
And the parking lot classes.
That's right. Clearly somebody thinks I should be doing other than because it's 5 o'clock. So it's a good start. I think we've got a long way to go on this with these public comments, and in particular we need counsel to deal with the secret questions, but I think we all are probably going to have to do a complete review of the document to get into the questions of the effectiveness analysis and the level of detail. And I think it would be good if the board could give us, especially some direction about the parts of the CEQA and guidelines that would be really good background reading, for the kind of the critical portions of that document for us all to go through, because it is a large document. But those that are particularly relevant to the questions that are raised here, the comments would be useful.
How do you envision this, Jim, as far as timeline and working through this? Is this something we're going to do at each meeting here on out, or are we going to give us a couple months to catch it up, or need to think about that?
Welcome to Road Rules 2.0. So I think we had talked in the agendizing of things for meetings that we knew this was going to take us a bit to work through. And so, yeah, we'll have to have some more workshops. In some ways, I think today was important, but and some of the questions like environmental values, I think, or ecological values, will take a while. And some of them, like the pests and pathogens, I don't think will be that hard. But let's go through the nice summary and some more detail for our next workshop. And let's really try and go through this when we get due consideration of clustering your comments, your reactions to that issue. Spend the time on this with you. Okay. With that, I think it's time for us to call it a day. And so I'm going to, but let me check. I hadn't seen the indication we had any online comments yet. And I hadn't I called you to this podium many times to give me agency comments, but I had to ask if you had any other ones to yours today. And no members of the public in evidence and no cards in front of me.